listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan, and absent from the studio today, but present as always in spirit, you have the indefatigable Jamarl Thomas, normal host of the show, progressive host of the show. He is, however, he has a flu, basically. And so he's at home and not feeling good. It'll just be me today, and the producers occasionally joining me, and of course, wonderful guests. Without further ado, though, that means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And it is August 6th. It's a Friday, and it's just past 7 a.m. Eastern here in Washington, D.C. Let's get into the COVID news first up. There are about 112,000. Actually, wait a second. Austin, quick checkup. We update these numbers? No. Okay, I'm gonna come back to this. There's a slight, Jamarl's out, and so we're adapting. I'll come back to those COVID numbers. Continuing on with general COVID facts and COVID news this morning, indoor eating and entertainment venues across Italy will from today begin to require a COVID Green Pass. That's a certification which requires that a person show either proof of vaccination or proof of a negative PCR test within a 48-hour window of entering the venue. And again, that would be indoor eating, indoor entertainment, gyms, things like that. Basically, the same idea as the venues in New York City that will require the vaccine pass. However, in Italy, they require either proof of vaccination, proof of a negative PCR test, or proof of having recovered from COVID. Which is, again, those three options. I like the idea that they have more options, but something to talk about later, maybe. In Manila, the capital of the Philippines, restrictions are set to be imposed. That is the site of one of the worst COVID outbreaks in Southeast Asia. They're going to be imposing a 2-week lockdown, which will affect upwards of 13 million people, and which they're predicting will cost the country's economy upwards of $4 billion. That's in U.S. dollars. CNN has fired 3 staffers for working at its New York headquarters without a COVID-19 vaccination. An executive has stated that they have a zero-tolerance policy with non-vaccine compliance. And China has pledged to donate 2 billion doses of COVID vaccines around the world this year. They have also said that they would donate approximately $100 million, and that is again in USD, to a global effort to distribute the doses to developing countries. In national news, President Biden signed a bill into law awarding 4 congressional gold medals to Capitol Police and other law enforcement personnel who protected the Capitol building during the January 6th insurrection. On the matter, Biden stated that, quote, "America owes you a debt we can never fully repay," end quote, and also said, quote, "We can't allow the heroism of these officers to be forgotten," end quote. In international news, China has reacted to President Biden's decision to grant temporary safe haven to any Hong Kong residents currently in the U.S. They're calling the move, quote-unquote, gross interference. Biden said this was in response to China's continued assault on Hong Kong's autonomy. Also something I want to come back on. The Taliban has shot and killed the director of the Afghan government's Information Media Center. A Taliban spokesman said the man had been shot and killed, quote, in a special act of mujahideen, end quote. This comes as weird, barely a month out, a little bit more than a month out now from the full planned U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan on September 11th, although many of our forces have already departed, and apparently it's looking pretty scarce, at least when it comes to U.S. service personnel. And that, of course, is a full NATO withdrawal. Greece is waiting for a return of wildfires, and an extreme fire warning has been issued in Athens. This comes as ongoing historically high temperatures are helping to spread a blaze that has been burning on the outskirts of the city of Athens, also on a nearby island. North Korea's state media says that storms and flooding have raised thousands of homes. It's a set of events which will aggravate food shortages that were already ongoing in the country. And authorities in Seoul, South Korea, are investigating whether activists protesting the South Korean government's decision to buy fighter jets from the United States were actually North Korean activists on the payroll of Pyongyang working to spread a network in South Korea. That's their claim, at least. In Olympic news, so far the medal leaders in order are the United States, who made a huge leap, now leading by 18 medals, then China, Russian athletes, Great Britain, and Japan. China now has the most gold medals with 34. They have been in the lead, although that lead has shrunk. The U.S. is following at 30, then Japan with 22. It's a four medal lead with the gold count right now. But, I think it was like a 7 medal lead or something yesterday, something like that. They're closing the gap, is my point. Also, 2 Belarusian Olympic coaches have been stripped of their accreditation after they reportedly attempted to force the sprinter Kristina Tsimanskaya to return home. And the U.S. women's basketball team dominated Serbia 79-59 in the semifinals, in large part thanks to Brittany Griner's 15 points and 12 rebounds. They take on the winner of the Japan and France semifinal matchup next in the gold medal game. And in Earth and Science news, the raging fires in California have reached and decimated the historic gold rush town of Greenville. Little of the site remains, as some of the driest conditions in decades were reported in the area. Many of the lost buildings were constructed in the 19th century. And with that, those were our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And there we go. And now we're in the open segment. And Austin, I'm going to formally request that you please enter the studio. That will make my life a little bit easier. I'll be honest, folks. I've done this job for a little bit more than a year, and occasionally I would come into the studio to not to host, but to do like science segments. I had this 15-minute segment that I would do on the previous version of Fault Lines as a producer. Anyway, I was always with somebody in the studio, and the idea of being on my own, I learned, made me feel pretty queasy. When you're in there on your own, it gets kind of like nerve-wracking or whatever. And then yesterday came along, Jamarl was out. That was like the first day where unexpectedly, it was basically just me in here, and it actually was okay. We had, it was a decent show overall. We had to scramble a little bit. Having said that, it's still nice to have people in the room, especially when you're not talking with a guest or somebody like that. The monologue format, Jamarl has more experience with it. Soapbox, great show. And he has that built up. I do not. And so it's helpful to have people. Producer Austin Pally joining me in the studio now. How are you doing?
I'm good. Good.
Sorry
I was a little late. I'm trying to update that one headline.
No, you're good. Which one are you talking about?
The first one, COVID numbers.
Oh, thank you for doing that. Yeah, heads up for the audience, by the way. Every morning I give out these COVID numbers. I give out, the number of, you hear it if you listen to the show. And a lot of you probably don't like it for a variety of reasons.
No, you know what they really don't like?
What do they not like?
Okay, everyone in the comment section is going to be like, yes, they're finally talking about it. When we say about and we give an exact number of cases.
Yeah.
There's been about 127. Yeah, they lose their mind.
It's
They're like, say one, say about 120,000, or say there have been, and give the exact number.
I actually adapted that. I took that up as a policy after receiving earlier criticism, and I was like, I'm gonna do this, which will piss everybody off, but will technically be better in my opinion. Which is I was giving exact numbers, and people were like, well, how can you know that's how many exactly? And so
I please everyone.
You can't please everybody. And so it was just like about, and then I would give this extremely specific number, which I just, I sardonically find amusement in or something like that. I think it's funny.
Well, I think we should keep it because, we're using a single source, and it's going to vary based off your sources by even like 1 or 2 or 5 or so. We're trying our best to get the most exact number we can, but.
Exactly. That's also one thing I wanted to add in. I think Jamarl's mentioned this before. I think I've mentioned this before. Early on, I would vary my sources because I was trying to find the best ones. And then I realized the New York Times, which is supposed to be, and still is known in some sense as the newspaper of record, like the premier newspaper in the United States. Okay, if they're putting this out here, I will take this as a useful aggregate that's pretty consistent. And it's it has a dashboard with all of the statistics that is maintained meticulously from day to day. Anyway, that's what I use for the audience's sake. But there's a couple of kind of big things here and stuff that I wasn't around to talk about when, 2 days ago at this point, when it was just Jamarl hosting the show, like the New York City pass. I know that he covered that, and he and I were talking about that. Italy's implementing their version of it, which in my opinion is way better because in the New York City's version, you need to be vaccinated. And for a variety of people, a lot of people don't. For a variety of reasons, a lot of people don't want to get vaccinated. In Italy, you can either be vaccinated or you can have a negative PCR test. Or if you've recovered from COVID within the last 6 months, which would give you some natural immunity, then they're letting you back in too. And that's, I think, a lot of people in New York City. I've at least seen people complaining. I don't know how many people about like, hey, I got COVID, I got sick, I recovered, I'm basically immune at least for a period of time. So and I don't want to get a vaccine. So at least for right now, can you just let me in?
I mean, it is also just restaurants. So, I mean, you're not talking about the whole country or for New York, the whole state. It's really just restaurants or gyms.
Yeah.
So I mean, they have the right to do whatever they want. They're a private business.
It is true. Well, but if the state, if the city government, if they're requiring it, then all of a sudden it's not on the business's end.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, this stuff gets a little bit thorny. And New York City is a special case because it's like the most densely populated city in the United States. If I have my numbers right, last I checked, at least. Like that's a specific factual claim. Let me fact check that. But if it's not, literally the most, which I'm pretty sure it is, it's certainly like Manhattan, certainly up there.
You're right.
Yeah, 100%.
New York.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, and of course, it's part of the larger metroplex, but I think that's the point, is that it's a huge hub for people. And so of all the cities in the U.S., it's the one that you'd most want to lock down in this way. If you're thinking about it from an epidemiological perspective, what's up?
Well, I mean, technically it's Gutenberg, New Jersey, but they have a density of over 10,000 people per square mile.
Well, but they're tiny.
That's a lot.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. But it's New York City. But
Yeah.
That's a lot of people.
That's like Tokyo levels of people or approaching it or something like that. No, I guess my point is that's the hub where you'd want to have that kind of protection. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that they're the ones paving the way and then other cities will follow. And I assume like the Midwest is never going to follow. And not because I just don't think they really need to. The same.
Yeah. And okay, so I saw you added this one actually. CNN, I'm going to go back into this headline. CNN has fired 3 staffers for working at its New York headquarters without a COVID-19 vaccination. An executive stated that they have a zero tolerance policy with non-vaccine compliance. Also makes sense, but
they're just pushing their own agenda. I mean, it makes sense. It seems like they weren't willing to work with them at all, but it makes sense because all that they're pushing is like get the vaccine at all costs to protect everyone else. So for their brand image, they have to do this. And they're like the first company to really publicly put out there that, no, we are sticking with this. Everyone else has said, like, we are making sure our employees are. They're the first ones to publicly be like, we've fired people because, like, don't even come work for us unless you get vaccinated. So, I mean, makes total sense. It seems like they weren't willing to work with them and be like, okay, if you want to get PCR tested every other day or every 3 days, and if you want to wear a mask at work, then maybe we'll talk. But
yeah. Yeah, I think you're right about that. I mean, it is that they're trying to send a message, and it is that it's like, they're a company, they have a brand that they have to save. And I'm not saying that they're, of course, they're responding to genuine public health concerns, but that's part of the thought process that they have to be going through is we need to publicly fire these people in order to show that we're that strict about it. Because otherwise, if they're not, then their newscasters who are trying to be strict about it, all of them are suddenly undercut by the fact that they as a company, if it comes out that that CNN actually has a pretty lenient vaccination policy for its employees, and yet their newscasters are constantly talking about the importance of vaccination, well, then they look pretty hypocritical.
Right.
So, they want to show that they're being strict about it, and I get that. But there's another thing that this kind of brings up that has been bugging me a little bit, and I've seen it, maybe a couple other people talk about this too, which is the idea of the unvaccinated as a group or as a population is a new thing because we're all pushing for this one vaccine, for this one, as part of this one vaccination program, we're pushing for people to get vaccinated, to be literally correct, because there's more than one vaccine. We're pushing for that. It's a pretty unique time and way in which we're pushing for that, unlike the flu vaccine where, you have that every year and it's not like a life or death drive.
I mean, not everyone. I haven't gotten a flu vaccine in a while.
Exactly. There's not like
because you need to do it every year. It's like, do I want to do this year?
You don't technically need to.
I'll do it like every 3 years,
but it's almost like we're at the earliest stage of creating another flu, or that kind of thing, something like that, where like this is going to be another one of those epidemics where it recurs every, it's a seasonal thing, whatever.
Except coronavirus in nature is 2 to 3 times more infectious than influenza. So I remember I was looking up that number when I was still in school, and I was like, everyone keeps comparing this to influenza. I'm like, oh, it's not. It's worse.
Yes, yeah. Well, and that's the thing is early on, people were downplaying it. But like we created this new group of people, the unvaccinated as a population. And then like the idea is Those are people who you're probably supposed to feel negative about. And for good reason. There's like a public health crisis. But I'm just saying, like, conceptually, this is happening. We created this category, and we're now thinking negatively about that. And there's both value in that, but also, I'm going to point out, we could have had another whole, if we'd had a different approach to this pandemic, I don't know that group would exist, and I don't know that we'd feel the same way about them, which would mean that we'd have a healthier society. And I don't know if this is relevant or important or if anybody actually cares about it, but it's like people, on this issue, along with so many others, people argue with each other and increasingly don't like each other. And like the in-group and out-groupiness of it is getting, stronger as time goes on.
Right. Well, anti-vaxxers have been around forever. I
Yes.
mean, we know that. But I mean, I go to the March for Life as many years as I can. And there's still always a group there that says, like, you can't be pro-life and pro-vaccine because there's the stem cell research.
Yeah.
But I feel like we've severely popularized it. And then, like, this is the age where misinformation spreads because it's now, you pretty much can say, you know what, about 50% of the country is behind me if I'm not for it or if I am for it. So, or at least a healthy number of people to where you're not looked out as crazy and you can, like, really dive into the rabbit hole. It's like if I'd say a third of the scientific community came out tomorrow and said, you know what, flat earthers, you're right. And then all of a sudden they'd emerge in hordes. And then they'd convert the sphere earthers. So I think because it's popularized, it's grown so much, like the anti-vax movement.
It makes sense. But you're saying that, and I can see it, but I wouldn't want to assume it. You're saying that a lot of there's overlap. The March for Life crowd, like pro-life community.
There's always
People think of as
protesters
right-wingers.
protesting the protest.
What are you talking about?
So March for Life is basically a bunch of pro-lifers that are protesting Roe v. Wade,
Yes.
protesting abortion.
Yeah.
There's always a fair group every so often down the stretch that are protesting the protest,
Yeah.
that are saying, like, why are you taking away our rights to choose? And like, you can't be pro-life and pro-vaccine. And then, yeah, there's like feminism groups, but there's also groups that are like, I'm pro-woman and pro-life. So, like, you can have both.
I see. Interesting. So one thing, actually, this is a complete segue from the COVID stuff, but on the March for Life, we had the Women's March back in early 2017, following, I think it was during the inauguration of Trump, basically following his election, of course. Massive march, like the biggest march I'd ever seen in person, and I've seen many of them. But also the March for Life, these consistently, and a lot of people in the community know, they're both A, very big, and B, don't receive all that much media attention. In other words, like, they're fairly consistently, in DC specifically, this massive March for Life on an annual basis. It gets hundreds of thousands of people to come out and then kind of gets undercovered. Is that true in your opinion? What's your take on that?
No, it's pretty much when you're down there, you can't go a block without seeing 2 or 3 news crews. And they just pull people randomly. They'll, like, try to pull priests here and there. They'll pull random people, like, why are you marching? Why are you here? And they're running like 24-hour news cycles on it.
Yeah.
So, and even on, like, the years that I wasn't able to go, when I was living up in Connecticut, New York, and it was a 7-hour bus ride at 4 a.m, like, sometimes I wouldn't get to go, and we'd watch the news on it. And it seems like every year they know, let's send out a crew. It's getting covered. It's at least in the cycle every hour. So I think it's covered. Plus, if you think about, like, major protests in the United States, it's one of, like, the top 3.
Yeah.
So I think it's been covered enough. I mean, not like you need to stop, but I think that one, like, they've done justice to it because you can't ignore that amount of people. There's like hundreds of thousands that show up every year.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is like the premier, conservative protest movements in the United States. On an annual basis, the size of that march, you can't beat that.
Yeah.
On the right. And it's like annual, which I guess is what's interesting. I guess part of this is my dad's right wing, hung out with him and worked with him journalistically for years. And so you circulate with different communities of people. And I remember some people saying that. I remember some people describing that march that way, that it happens so constantly. It's massive. And then from their perspective, the media didn't really give it its due, due coverage or whatever, especially compared to the Women's March, which they saw happening at the same time. I remember people talking about in that way in 2018. It's part of, like, the larger left versus right thing in the U.S.,
I think it gets covered enough on the day. It's forgotten the day before and forgotten the day after. So on the day, it gets like, okay, we can't ignore 100,000 people marching through the streets.
Yeah.
But like, okay, life moves on the next day, and it's in their minds.
It's one of those massive issues that almost, it feels to me like it's like culturally the conversation has sort of moved on officially, but unofficially it hasn't at all.
No,
like that's
I
still
disagree.
a really, really important issue.
I disagree. You've got
a lot
Texas
of people
legislation, you've got Mississippi and Alabama legislation that are all trying to bring it back so that way we can whittle it down to a pretty much pro-life state. And like, I think that that's amazing. And you're never going to win the war in one battle. So it's not going to go from, okay, you can have an abortion at any stage during pregnancy to no abortion. So it's going to have to be whittle it down, whittle it down, whittle it down. And that's kind of, we have to win it battle by battle. And if we've got to start there, then we've got to start there. I mean, in nature is such a divisive issue, and in nature requires you to care about it. If you are pro-life, then you cannot stop fighting it, because you're saying, everyone likes to say, and I see in the comments all the time, well, you're restricting a woman's right to choose. Well, you're restricting a human life as well. You're restricting either the development or like the natural birth of a human life. So if you're valuing the rights of a person or a woman to choose, then you have to value the right to life as well.
No, totally. And each side has a lot to care about when it comes to this, because in either case, it's like a pretty serious. It's a person whose life is ultimately being affected,
right?
In either from each side's perspective.
Even if you think it's a bunch of cells until absolute natural birth, then you're hindering that life, and you have to at least see how my side feels so strongly about it, because at the very least, you can see how in our mind it is a human life that you're killing.
I hear you.
So that's why we take it so seriously, and that's why you get 100,000 people out every single year.
You're right that technically there is constant movement on it on a state level, and admittedly, Roe v. Wade, there is a big question that's lingering. Will that be overturned? But it also simultaneously feels like this debate that's like 20, 30 years, something like that. Like it's not. It is both something that's constantly present, but also not something that feels like a current. Like I'll give you an example. As stupid as it is and as trivial as it seems, the whole like trans people being in bathrooms, which is like a marginal issue, arguably a pretty darn marginal issue, that feels more timely than abortion, even though it's far less significant objectively than for each side. And
well, it came with like the progressive movement.
What's that?
It came with the progressive movement. So yeah. I think it's just like a result of the time. Yeah. But if ever there was a time for it to start, it would be now. Like it would be like if Roe v. Wade happened last year, there would still be like uproar about it. So I think there hasn't been enough time on that to really see if it was. Also was accepted by the general public. I mean, most major, I know Target's done it, Walmart's done it. They just have gotten rid of gendered bathrooms in general.
Yeah.
And I think the best way to really appease both people for that is just like single-use bathrooms.
You mean just like unisex?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
because I mean, you've had gyms that got into real hot water with that being like, well, this man identifies as a woman, but he's walking into the woman's locker room, and then you've got like 3 or 4 women that are coming out and saying like, hey, I don't feel comfortable bringing my daughter in here.
Yeah.
Just me. Like he's just like there. And I mean, you're preaching to make women comfortable, or for men shouldn't make women uncomfortable. But then you're also allowing them into like intimate spaces.
It's just more expensive that way, because you need to build, instead of having 2 main restrooms with a lot of stalls individually, you'd have to have a handful, like 4, 5, 6 different rooms, that kind of thing, to accommodate the same number of people. If you want to have them like a single use, you enter into your own room. You know what I mean? That's my point.
Yeah, or make them wait outside.
Or you make them wait outside. That's the thing. But for larger venues, it gets hard. Anyway, no, I agree. That is how you would technically solve that. I can nitpick it to death, but that solves the problem immediately. And it's more pleasant to use. I don't think most people do like, using the bathroom in a room with like 8 other people sitting anonymously.
You mean when there's still enough space in between the door panels where you can see the person?
See the person, yeah, these weird reflections in the mirror.
The floor is like 1.5 to 2 feet up. That's only an American issue.
Oh, is that really?
It's only American for the exact reason that you think. It's so that way for both custodial staff and people trying to use the bathroom can tell if there's someone in there. You're not supposed to be able to identify them. But for anyone that knows, if you're trying to see in a stall if someone's there and they look up, you make eye contact.
Our engineers are pervs. Or what is it? Why did they do that?
It's just so that way you can tell if someone's in there.
Just to check, yes.
Yeah.
Custodial staff. Yeah. Interesting. Very interesting. Well, look at how far we've come in the conversation. a direct tangent off of COVID news. Okay, well, I have you in the room. I want to do a quick question here. It has been a day. The Olympics are almost wrapped up. Stuff closing out on Sunday. A couple of things we could talk about here. But I suppose basketball news?
I think I'm going to save the Olympics for probably, I believe, next hour you're going to bring in Cordell.
Yes.
Yeah, save the Olympics for him. If you really want a hot take, go to 6. The only national headline we have for today. President Biden signed a bill into law about 4 congressional gold medals to Capitol Police.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. This is just such an abhorrent bid from the left to keep it in the news. And it's so disgusting to me because you are all of a sudden saying, you know what, you police officers did your job. And here is the highest medal that we can give a civilian in this country for doing your job. Now, granted, I believe that the police are doing their job is a very hard thing. It's like with the military as well. We have to commend them for what they do. But where was the support for the police that were fighting back against rioters and looters and Black Lives Matter protests? Where's their medals? Where is even recognition that they did something right?
Well, in this case...
But no, defund them then. But now because it's the right, now they get medals.
Well, because it's the right and because it's politicians whose necks are getting saved. The nation's politicians whose necks are getting saved.
It's like the longer they can string this out and leave it in the media, the more that it serves their agenda.
I guess I'm a little bit confused on exactly how many gold medals are getting given out and to whom they're being given. Because you have many hundreds of police who are serving on the day, and yet they only get 4 medals. And I'm guessing that's not per person. So do they each get a sliver of a gold medal?
No, it's like the leadership, really. It's like if a battalion wins a battle, then you give it to the general. It's a symbolic thing. It's like,
oh gosh,
the precinct, the head of the precinct gets one, and your people did good, but you're the leader of it, so you get the recognition.
Because here's the thing: it's like if a soldier gets a Purple Heart, it's not the president who gets to put it on their own lapel. It's not like the president who decides to wear it. It's the people. It's the person who's injured in the line of duty. It's like the person who wins the award. I guess that's a more general grievance than the one you're bringing up here, which is they should get the medals. They should individually be given 4 gold medals per person.
Because America owes you a debt we can never fully repay.
Yes.
And we can't allow the heroism of these officers to be forgotten.
It is true. Well, and because it was politicians that they were protecting, right? I mean, in the cities that were the sites of these riots last year, it was only a few politicians at a time who were under threat. It was okay, Portland's mayor is surrounded by a crowd of angry people who are throwing things at him. That's one guy. But this is hundreds of politicians in the same room together, hundreds of representatives in the House and senators and their aides and the building staff, all of them there. It's like I'm put in the mind of, 19th century, a valiant soldier saves the queen's life or something, and he gets a special commendation. She gives him an award personally. That fictional scenario feels kind of like what's going on here. It's like they saved their necks, right?
Well, how effective really were the police that day? I mean, I don't think they could have done any better. They did a good job, sure. I really think that police officers, as long as you're not a dirty scoundrel or racist or anything like that, I think the police officers in general have a really hard job and they need to be commended for what they do. But they still got in the Capitol.
It was true.
They still stormed it. There was still some violence and some vandalism there. But
well, and I guess part of what's also screwed up is that that Nancy Pelosi, particularly, pardon me, Nancy Pelosi particularly was one of the 2 people in Congress responsible for calling cops back, along with Mitch McConnell, dealing with the House and the Senate sergeants at arms specifically, who are basically the people in charge of Capitol Police. They said this wasn't going to be a big deal. So in other words, they reduced the number of police officers who were at the site of the Capitol building for January 6th, which means that the cops who get hurt or injured or suffer PTSD, and the very fact that the protesters get into the building, all of that, the intensity of it is made worse by this decision. And then they decide to give them an award after the fact. I guess they could have made better decisions on the day. I mean,
it's because like what makes for a better like thumbnail, really, like a line of riot shields and officers that are pushing back protesters. It's like protesters are angry outside the Capitol, or 4 or 5 police getting trampled in a mob because they're trying to get in and they succeed. And it's like we're being attacked at our nation's core.
I hear you. Yeah.
And so it's all about the narrative. It's all about it's so politicized in everything that they do. Like, why is this still in the news? I'm sorry. Like, why can't we get like a monthly update, right? And like, oh, we had the trial for some of the people that were there, which I believe should also happen for BLM, like for the people that are throwing bricks into windows and beating up store clerks and all that. Where are those trials? But we've had the trials for these people. We've had the assembly of the committee. But why is it like every other day, January 6th, January 6th, January 6th? Let's not forget January 6th. They literally are immortalizing into our minds like a 9/11 scenario.
Yes.
And that's just like abhorrent how you're toying with the public like that.
It's interesting because I completely agree with you, but I can also step into the mind of somebody who's like, well, but Austin, wasn't it a historic breach of the Capitol? Wasn't it a historic event that we haven't seen in this country? Like, more egregious in some ways, in some weird, convoluted ways, more egregious than 9/11 or Pearl Harbor, worse than that, because it was our own citizens, Austin. It was the people of this country who were swayed by a tyrannical dictator. And I kind of just stumble at that point.
Really good at buying into the narrative.
What do you say?
You're really good at buying into exactly what they want you to.
I can say that if I want to. I can put on a puppet show.
Right. I mean, it's just that's exactly what they want you to feel and what want you to think. So then in that same mindset, where do the BLM protests go down in history in your mind as like brave and courageous for what they stand for? Maybe for what they stand for.
Well, I mean, I don't want to. Again,
in actuality, it's kind of like,
I hear you. I was stepping into a caricature, and if I wanted to continue the most DNC-ified version of that caricature, I would say, well, with the Black Lives Matter protests, ultimately they were fighting for something that was worth it, and that some people stepped out of line, and some people did things, and they betrayed the other people who were protesting in the process, and we should be unified in rejecting the actions of the people who were rioting. But BLM as a whole is a worthy cause, because they weren't. If you remember, we got to go to a break because we're late to go to our guest Mark Sloboda, and we have some stuff to talk about with him. We're going to be talking about the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh, in and around Nagorno-Karabakh, which is a sort of a conflict zone between Armenia and Azerbaijan that was the site of a war that we were covering pretty diligently on Fault Lines late last year. That war went into a ceasefire. And now each side is accusing the other of violating the ceasefire. This whole conflict has been mediated by Russia, and Turkey was also involved, although to a lesser degree than Russia. And now, again, each side is accusing the other of breaking the ceasefire. We'll be talking about what the situation on the ground is looking like from afar with Mark Sloboda, our Moscow-based geopolitical analyst, and a friend of the show. I would definitely consider Mark a friend of the show. Anyway, we'll be back with Mark on the other side of this short break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones? With the historical context to tie them together, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Although, again, to remind folks listening into the show, Jamarl Thomas, normal co-host of the show, is out sick. He has the flu or something very similar to it. I don't think it's COVID, though. But he's out sick right now. It's just me in the studio with producers occasionally joining in. And on the line, we have our guest, Mark Sloboda, international relations and security analyst. Follow him on Twitter at MarkSloboda1. Find him on Facebook at facebook.com/Gramsci. Mark, Thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
Shane, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on Fault Lines.
Hey, it's great to have you. Great to talk. Let's get into it. I wanted to bring you on. We might move into other territory depending on how this goes, but I wanted to talk about Armenia and Azerbaijan because conflict has been popping back up there. I hear, at least, they're accusing each other of violating the ceasefire after there's been some light skirmishing. And I believe it was originally, I'll let you get into the details. And then I want to go, briefly before we sort of get further into the implications of this, I want to go into the history of this, what led up to it, the events of last year, the preceding history in the Soviet Union, sort of what set this up. I want to come back to that. But first, the proximate events. What's been happening over the last couple of weeks, the last month, Mark?
Yeah, you got a few hours? Okay. So skirmishing is the best way to describe it. There has been some small localized fighting in several different areas along the border. Some of it is simply a result of ongoing hatred between the two peoples and local units taking out their frustrations and anger and hatred outside of the chain of command or any broader thing. That's quite normal to such ceasefire agreements, and it's unfortunate it happens. It causes some deaths, some injuries. Then there's another, shall we say, area of the ongoing skirmishing that is due to the fact that there's no real formal borders between Armenia and Azerbaijan that are delineated, right? For the most part, both sides are kind of hedging around the Soviet borders, but there's lots of problem with those. There's enclaves and exclaves on each side that are still within each other's borders that were not formally covered by the ceasefire. These are gray areas, and that's where a lot of this conflict is also happening, this skirmishing. And then there is a problem in southern Armenia, which is known in Armenian as Sunik, and is once again now being referred to Azerbaijan under the name of West Zangezur, which is an old Russian empire name for the region. And much like former colonial borders of the British and French empires caused so much problem in the Middle East and the subcontinent, there's problems between old Russian Empire and Soviet borders, and the conflict, the contradictions between the two of those breaking out here. And the Azerbaijani president is pushing Armenia right now to a permanent peace deal. They're pushing them, of course, by military pressure. And a lot of nationalist, irredentist political rhetoric. They've started referring to regions of southern Armenia by basically Azerbaijani names that invoke their claims to ancestral lands now in Armenia. And as part of the ceasefire that was agreed to and brokered by Russia, there is supposed to be a corridor established, a transit trade corridor across southern Armenian territory in this Sunik Zangezur region. If you take a look at a map, you really have to pull up a map. You see that Azerbaijan, there's actually a small southwestern section of Azerbaijan that is separated from the rest of Azerbaijan. It's called Nakhchivan. It's up against Turkey on the far side of Armenia. This is because, Armenians and Azerbaijanis were kind of scattered all around. They weren't all in one, nation state, when this process of empires and religions and ethnicities all began. There's supposed to be a corridor allowed now by Armenia across this. And of course, the Armenians are moving really slowly on this. Azerbaijan would like a permanent peace deal to cement the claim, their victory, basically, their recovery of all their internationally recognized territory. And they would also like Armenia to give up the rest of Nagorno-Karabakh. And to do that, they are pressuring them by essentially starting to make claims to this southern Armenian region where this corridor is supposed to be established. They're just starting to make rhetorical claims to take it entirely themselves, which would link, of course, both parts of Azerbaijan and drastically reduce Armenia's territory in the process. And to give you an idea of the language that the Azerbaijani president Aliyev is starting to use, he recently said, Yerevan, meaning the capital of Armenia, is historical Azerbaijani territory.
Really? Oh, wow.
But we don't have any territorial claims. If we can go back to the Zangezur corridor, why not Yerevan? But this doesn't mean with tanks. It just means why not? This is our position. He's threatening. He's saying we have the military superiority at this point. You have low international support. You're a landlocked country. He's basically – this is a pressure. He wants Armenia to give up all claims to Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan, this Armenian ethnic enclave. He wants to say, no, you don't control it. It doesn't have any autonomy. It just becomes Azerbaijan, the way that internationally recognized borders should say. And in return, we'll give up any claims to Zangezur, i.e. southern Armenia. It's kind of a blackmail, if you will, to a permanent peace agreement. And, this would cement their claims. It would give them full control back of Nagorno-Karabakh, which would, of course, lead to all kind of problems with the majority Armenian population there. But also, it would, be extremely politically beneficial for Aliyev. It would. A permanent peace deal might very well get Russian troops out of their territory, which is something they would also like. Because right now, Russian peacekeepers are deployed not only in Nagorno-Karabakh, but along certain areas of the Armenia-Azerbaijani border to, try to stop or limit this skirmishing. The Armenian Prime Minister, Pashinyan, has actually asked Russia to put troops along the entire Armenian-Azerbaijani border, which Russia basically just ignored, because that would be a step of involvement and a protection of Armenia that Russia, doesn't want to commit to. They don't want to get drawn into this conflict, and if possible, they would like to emerge from it with, at least some level of decent relations with both Armenia, which is actually a part of military treaties with them, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, a rough analog of NATO in Eurasia. But they also have pretty decent relationships with Azerbaijan, and they don't want to see Azerbaijan, all of their influence with Azerbaijan, ceded to Turkey, which is strongly backing Azerbaijan. So it's a really complicated situation. Armenia is in a bad situation. Politically, they still have the very weak prime minister at home. He just won re-election somehow, even though pre-election polls had him losing. He won by a very large margin. There are accusations of vote rigging and all kinds of stuff on the other side. But right now, international recognition lies with that. It would be a political window now for him to make some type of deal to close this scenario. But anything that saw him giving up Nagorno-Karabakh would be political suicide for him, his party, that he created and everything else. So Armenia is in a really weak position, and Azerbaijan is poking them to make all of this permanent and give up a little bit more in the process.
Mark, that was an excellent, extremely comprehensive overview. And with that, I want to, just to give us enough time when we come back, I want to take us to a kind of brief and early break, but because we covered, I think, pretty much all of the essential ground there. When we come back, I want to briefly go into the recent prehistory of this, from the late 80s up through the present, what this conflict has looked like, how much it's moved, how it's shifted, the significance of last year's war, what happened there, who Nikol Pashinyan is, and getting, you were just talking about his re-election, looking at his options here, because he was, as far as I can tell, certainly there are two sides to this, but he seems to be slightly more the bellicose rhetorically aggressive one in terms of early posturing, in terms of a lot of what happened here. But I'll let you correct me if you think I'm wrong on some of this. We'll get back into it. With that, having a great conversation with Mark Sloboda, International Relations and Security Analyst. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Although, quick heads up, Jamarl Thomas, my normal co-host here, is out. He is sick with the flu. So for now, it is just me, Shane, in the studio. I am joined, however, on the phone by Mark Sloboda. He's an international relations and security analyst. Mark, thank you again for sticking with me. I want to get right back into this conversation. Starting off, the last 30 or so years of conflict, can you lay this out? What the origins of Armenia and Azerbaijan, how they were related to the Soviet Union. You talked about the old Russian Empire versus the Soviet sort of territorial, boundaries, lines. Just what set this conflict up? Ethnic rivalries, when it started, and leading up basically to last year's war, what it looked like. Mark.
Okay, well, conflict in the region between, shall we say, East and West has been going on since at least ancient Roman times. I mean, ancient Rome and Parthia were fighting over exactly this territory. And this is before there was a Christianity, before there was an Islam, before there was a kingdom of Armenia at the time. There wasn't a state of Azerbaijan. But as the Soviet Union, during the Russian Empire period, large portions of these two countries were incorporated into the Russian Empire, and at least the new region of southern Armenia, Syunik, now Zangezur, this was Azerbaijani territory in those times, and it was called Zangezur. This area of southern Armenia. It belonged to Azerbaijan at the time. Then, as the during the Soviet Union, when the Bolsheviks incorporated both Armenia and Azerbaijan into the Soviet Union, that particular territory of Zangezur was transferred to Armenia. But because Armenia and Azerbaijan were both part of the Soviet Union, and there was relative goodwill between the two countries. I mean, there were intermarriages, there were neighbors, were inviting each other to their wedding. There wasn't the conflict was bottled up at the very least, and to some extent it didn't exist. But then, as the Soviet Union started to fall apart, all these nationalist settlements, sentiments all across the Soviet Union broke out, and in Armenia and Azerbaijan is one of those ethno-nationalist / religious clashes that broke out, that people don't realize how violent the breakup of the Soviet Union actually was. I mean, there was a lot of deaths, and they fought over territory. They fought over this primarily over this Armenian ethnic enclave within Azerbaijani territory, Nagorno-Karabakh. Most of the people who live there now are Armenian and were even at the time of the Soviet breakup, less, but still majority Armenian at the time. But Armenia had the military upper hand then, and went further and took a huge chunk of Azerbaijani territory, basically all around Nagorno-Karabakh. They occupied 7 territories of what had been Azerbaijan in the Soviet Union. And most of these areas, these 7 occupied territories, had Azerbaijani majority populations at the time, and Armenia ethnically cleansed them pretty heinously. And there are no
Mark,
good guys.
I want to pause on that for
Don't
just a second. I want to pause on that for just a second, because this is what sets us up for the most recent conflict. But something that comes to mind for me.
Yeah.
What is the value of taking that territory? Is it economically valuable? What is the, as far as I can tell, it's mountainous. It doesn't seem like, maybe strategically in terms of military positioning, it's valuable. But
it's mostly strategic in terms of links and protection of Nagorno-Karabakh. There are also, of course, opposing nationalist ancestral lands claims to both sides. To this territory was ours several hundred, 20 years ago, 100 years ago, several thousand years ago. There's all types of historical claims by both sides to basically every contested square inch on both sides of each country.
That makes, and so there's a sort of symbolic value, and strategically it might be useful, but I guess part of what brings this to mind for me and what makes this a little bit significant is that it's not particularly economically valuable. And Azerbaijan, in last year's war, it's revealed they have a strong economic lead based on oil sales and their relationship with Turkey, and certainly they were getting some subsidization, so to speak, by Turkey going on militarily, but they also have a much stronger economy in terms of supporting their military
because of oil and gas wealth. Yes, they've really developed, and they've developed their military as a consequence of that. They had to suffer these last 30 years of occupation of large parts of their country, these 7 territories, by Armenia. I believe Armenia was at fault. They didn't trade these territories back in return for some type of permanent peace deal and recognition of autonomy for Nagorno-Karabakh. That they paid the price, as far as I'm concerned anyway, with this. They should have given that territory back. It was majority Azerbaijan at the time, that they seized it. It was ethnically cleansed. There are no good guys, right? Don't look for white hats, black hats back here. There's been nasty ethnic cleansing on both sides. It's wrong, I think, to look at it that way. There's a lot of sympathies in Russia towards Armenia because they're an Orthodox people, but also their current prime minister has been trying to sidle up to the West pretty suicidally because they can't give him and haven't given him any type of even political or military help in all of this. Meanwhile, Azerbaijan has been getting closer to Turkey and Israel, who has also supplied them with drones and other military technology as a hedge against Iran, because Azerbaijan and Iran don't necessarily always have good relations, because there is a very large Azerbaijani minority in northwestern Iran. Iran has a small border with both Armenia and Azerbaijan, so it gets kind of complicated and geopolitical at that point. But Russia would like to balance relations between the two of them and just come to an agreement on these, small parcels of territory that really, for the rest of the world, don't mean a lot. But of course, these countries are small. A transport corridor or recovering or taking territory, in southern Armenia would be a big economic boost to Azerbaijan, because that would link both sides of their country and create a transport corridor from the Caspian Sea to their, across their territory to their ally Turkey, and that would be a big benefit to both of those countries economically.
And that would
to Armenia,
that transport
Armenia, it is.
Go for it.
Yeah, southern Armenia also, of course, has a transport corridor to Iran through southern Armenia, which there isn't a huge amount of trade going on, but it's better than nothing. Armenia is a landlocked country, and with Turkey on one side, Azerbaijan on the other, a border with Georgia, which is had very contentious relationships with them lately because Georgia is pushing for NATO membership and Armenia is in the CSTO. Armenia doesn't have a lot of great trade or political options. The consequence of their geography. So losing that territory to Azerbaijan would, cut off any possible trade or relations with Iran, which is something they don't want to lose either.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, coming back to Nikol Pashinyan for a second, and I suppose also just directly last year's war. Who is Nikol Pashinyan, and what was last year's war, Mark?
Yeah. Okay. So Nikol Pashinyan, is a relatively new politician. He came to power in protests after elections that were accused of being rigged by the other side. The long-standing Armenian government, kind of a coalition of parties at that point. He has definitely, he dreamed, I'm quite sure, and certainly a lot of his supporters did, of leaning Armenia to the West. And that would be great if Armenia was actually not in the middle of Eurasia and not a landlocked country and not in already military, support with Russia. I mean, we have to remember that at one point, Armenia, requested, protection from Russia, from Turkey, and so forth. So there's a long history, shall we say, of Russian paternalism of Armenia, and there are lots of Armenians that appreciate that, and there are some that don't. Right now, once again, it has been punched home to the Armenian people, squeezed between Turkey and Azerbaijan, that their security, their sovereignty depends on Russia. Which is not a nice thing for them necessarily to have to deal with, but it's a geopolitical reality of their geography and their culture and history, and there's really no escaping it for them. So Pashinyan might have dreamed of tilting to the West, but his disastrous loss of Armenia in this most recent conflict that he may have helped instigate by supposedly being, this liberal politician, he came in and suddenly started making nationalist claims to Nagorno-Karabakh, this Armenian ethnic enclave inside what should be by international law Azerbaijani territory. He said it was part of Armenia, flat out. I mean, not it should be autonomous, not so on. He said it was part of Armenia, inseparable part of Armenia, and that was something that no Armenian leader had actually, certainly the president, had come out and said before. He said this as a new prime minister. And, Azerbaijan already starting to feel the strength of their economy and consequence military buildup, and having suffered for almost three decades with a large chunk of their territory military occupied and having been ethnically cleansed by Armenia, they took advantage of the situation, their new relationship with Turkey, Armenia being on, shall we say, the political outs with Russia, and they took all that territory back. And they took a chunk, the second biggest city in Nagorno-Karabakh, Shushi, depending on which side you go on as well. And then they agreed to this Russian brokered ceasefire, which saved the rest of Nagorno-Karabakh for the moment. It's still being governed basically locally with Russian oversight. But Azerbaijan certainly hasn't given up any claims to it. To the contrary, where once they considered giving it autonomy, now that's no longer discussed at all.
And one last point before we go, because we're just about out of time now. Nikol Pashinyan, the prime minister we've been talking about, who started this and kind of spontaneously or unpredictably to me from the outside with these sort of more nationalistic, bellicose claims on Azerbaijani territory. He
careless, yeah.
Yes, he was careless. He pushed for that. They lost the war, and there was a time there where there were crowds of people calling, basically calling for his head, effectively, but at the very least calling for him to be removed from office. And yet he wins. He wins re-election, which is inexplicable to me.
Yeah, I have a lot of questions.
You have a lot of questions about that election.
Pre-election polls and everything.
We've got to. I hear you on that, and that's something we've got to come back to some other time. We've got to close this out. Mark Sleboda, thank you for joining us. Mark Sleboda, for those listening, international relations and security analyst. Follow him on Twitter at MarkSleboda1. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back with headlines in just a minute.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another hour, our second to last this morning and this week, of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states we call America and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan, and in the left corner, or at least normally sitting there, we have Jamarl Thomas, progressive, indefatigable political analyst and co-host of the show. He is, however, feeling under the weather, and so he's staying at home. It's just me in the studio with producers Austin Pelly and Cordell Woodland joining me at the top of the hour as we go in. But without further ado, let's get into headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And in COVID stats, right up here, there are about 127,108 new COVID cases that were reported in the United States yesterday. There are also about 439 new deaths added yesterday. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 100,000 cases per day. That's an increase of 119% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 50% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 58% of residents have received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected about 35,565,000 people across the United States, and it has killed approximately 615,000 of us. In Italy, indoor eating and entertainment venues across the country will from today begin to require a COVID Green Pass. That's a certification which requires that a person show either proof of vaccination, proof of a negative PCR test within a 48-hour window of entering the venue, or proof of having recovered from COVID within the 6 months prior. I'm going to point out the second and the third options, in my opinion, would be great. They would do a lot to dispel the arguments and the debates over stuff in New York City. I want to come back to this. There's a larger point I was thinking about the other day that I want to make, which is the COVID, the like NYC key to NYC pass in New York City is entirely about getting people vaccinated, not about keeping people safe. That is my claim, and I can back it up because the brief argument here is they're basically saying you only need one dose of these 2-dose vaccines to enter restaurants. But if you remember, one dose doesn't protect you. You need that second dose to fully protect you. In other words, they're perfectly okay having unprotected people come into the restaurants. It's not about keeping them safe. All that they want is for them to get on the track to vaccination. But I feel like that's going to bite them in the butt. I think that's a kind of counterintuitive thing, and Italy's handling it in a better way, even though technically it might not be as doing an effective job at getting people vaccinated, but might save more lives. Anyway, I've got more headlines to get to, so let's get to them. Restrictions are set to be imposed in Manila. That's the capital of the Philippines. It is the site of one of the worst COVID outbreaks right now in Southeast Asia. The 2-week lockdown in Manila will affect upwards of 13 million people, and it's set to cost the economy upwards of $4 billion in USD. That's US dollars. CNN has fired 3 staffers for working at its NYC headquarters without a COVID-19 vaccination. An executive has stated that they have a zero-tolerance policy with non-vaccine compliance. I had a fun conversation about this with Austin earlier. China, meanwhile, has pledged to donate 2 billion doses of COVID vaccines around the world this year. They have also said that they would donate about $100 million US towards getting COVID doses and vaccines to developing countries. In national political news back here in the States, President Biden signed a bill into law awarding 4 congressional gold medals to Capitol Police and other law enforcement personnel who protected the Capitol building during the January 6th insurrection. On the matter, Biden stated, quote, "America owes you a debt we can never fully repay," end quote, and said, quote, "We can't allow the heroism of these officers to be forgotten," end quote. In international news, China has reacted to President Biden's decision to grant temporary safe haven to any Hong Kong residents currently in the U.S., calling the move, quote-unquote, gross interference. Biden said this was in response to China's continued assault on Hong Kong's autonomy, also a slightly controversial statement. The Taliban has shot and killed the director of the Afghan government's Information Media Center. They're being hit on this for their attacks on journalists more generally, but this is an Afghan government sort of prominent official responsible for handling information. A Taliban spokesman said the man had been shot and killed, quote, "in a special act of mujahideen," end quote. Greece is waiting for wildfires, is waiting for a return of wildfires, and an extreme fire warning has been issued in Athens. This comes as ongoing historically high temperatures are helping to spread a blaze that has been burning on the outskirts of the city. North Korea's state media says that storms and flooding have razed thousands of homes across the country, a set of events which will aggregate food shortages that are reportedly ongoing in the country. And authorities in Seoul, South Korea, are investigating whether activists protesting the South Korean government's decision to buy fighter jets from the United States were actually North Korean activists working to create a network of support for North Korean efforts in South Korea. In Olympic news, so far the medal leaders in order are the United States, who made a huge leap and are now leading by 18 medals. Then China is second, Russian athletes are in third, then it's Great Britain and Japan following up in fifth. For the gold medal count, China has the most gold medals right now with 34. The U.S. is following at 30, and Japan is sitting with 22. 2 Belarusian Olympic coaches have been stripped of their accreditation after attempting to force the sprinter Kristina Tsimanskaya, that's the Belarusian sprinter, to return home. If you remember, the Belarusian government was trying to get her to return home after she said that she wanted to not go back to Belarus and was seeking asylum in other countries. She has successfully received Polish asylum, but this is after reportedly the Belarusian government was going after her family, and her husband fled the country, and her parents were apparently being threatened, trying to get them to convince their daughter to go back home. Anyway, that's the recent history there. And these 2 coaches have been stripped of their accreditation after trying to get her to go back. The U.S. women's basketball team dominated Serbia with a 79-59 lead victory in the semifinals. That was in large part to Brittany Griner's 15 points and 12 rebounds. They will now take on the winner of the Japan and France semifinal matchup next in the gold medal game. And in earth and science news, the raging fires in California have reached and decimated the historic gold rush town of Greenville. Little of the site remains, as some of the driest conditions in decades were reported in the area. Many of the lost buildings were constructed in the 19th century. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And I'm now going to ask our producer, Cordell Woodland. Please do come into the studio. That would help me out quite a bit. Well, there's one that I wanted to go back to for a second. I'm having to sort of do this on the fly. I believe that it was the China one. There's a couple to go back to. For one thing, the Taliban shooting and killing the director of an Afghan government department, forget which department, it's the Information Media Center in this case. That's it feels like kind of a big deal to me. We haven't technically fully withdrawn, and yet they're already, going after and killing the heads of departments of the government that's currently sitting in power. Anyway, that's a big deal, and I want to talk to somebody about it, but I also feel like it's just going to be getting worse, and so we'll have ample opportunity to talk more about it soon with future guests on this show. Cordell Woodland joining me in the studio now. Thank you. How are you doing?
Not bad.
Good.
Thanks for bringing me in.
Thanks for coming on in. All right. Austin recommended I go to you in this hour for COVID news, COVID updates. It's ending this Sunday. So this is like the last day of coverage before it ends. I asked you yesterday, overall, how's it been going? What's new in the last day? What's been happening?
Well, you talked about it a little bit in the headlines. The women's national basketball team is going to the gold game, and the other semifinal game is going on right now between Japan and France, and Japan is really taking it to France right now. Japan is extremely quick. I'm not sure how they're going to match up against the U.S. women's team because they have so much size on the U.S. side, but this Japan team is playing together, and man, they are very, very fast and efficient. So that'll be a better matchup than I think people think. But it's pretty cool to me to see that the women's basketball team is going to the gold game, the men's basketball team is going to the gold game, and even the men's baseball team is going to the gold game as well. And they also U.S. men also won the wrestling gold this morning in like very great fashion. It actually came down to the very last second for him to get the last pin down, and that gave him the 2 points he needed to get the gold medal. So that was pretty cool to watch this morning. So U.S. is trying to put a dent in that lead that China has with the golds.
With the golds. We were talking. Well, we're going to be hearing this. We did a pre-recorded interview with Glenn Austin Anderson yesterday. We're going to be playing just a little bit later. He was talking. Pardon me. He brought up this conversation that we actually were having on the show yesterday. That I mentioned that folks will hear as they, if they listen to the interview. Where basically you have these two different competitions going on sort of simultaneously. There's the total medal competition and then the gold medal competition.
Right.
And you said that they basically, the U.S. is in the last day. They put a dent in the gold medal thing. But it seems like we've gone way further in terms of the total medal count.
Right.
Like we're quite out ahead in that count. Is that right at this point?
Yeah, and that's right. It really depends on what people decide to put as president. There's no, that's been the real struggle over the years is what is the ultimate winner here? Is it about who gets the most medals or who gets the most golds? And a lot of Americans want to be the best. They want to be the best, and being the best means getting the golds, which I understand. But to a degree, having the most medals for me is a big deal. I don't think that's something that can be overlooked. Because we're not dominant in every sport. Realistically, we're not. It's quite a few sports that here in America we simply don't care about. Just to put it bluntly, we don't care about. So we're not going to go out there and dominate at everything. But it is pretty good to see us dominating the way we are in total goals. I would like to see us, of course, leading the total gold count. But if we coming back with the most medals, that's still pretty cool to me. It
is pretty cool. Well, so one interesting thing, it seems like, I could totally be wrong on this one, but Japan was like near the front, specifically with the gold medals. I think they were tied for first, and they were in first place for the total gold medal count. That is with a much, much smaller population.
Right.
Of course, than China, but even compared to the United States, Japan is not just geographically a smaller country. It's, much smaller population, but yet they're like doing really well. Also Great Britain. Japan, I guess I'm bringing them up because they're the host, of course. Right. This is set in Tokyo. Is there like a home field advantage thing that kicks in with this?
Considering that there's no fans, I would say no. If there were fans in the building, then I could tell you right now that the fans would probably be going crazy right now for this women's basketball team that's going on with Japan taking it to France. But with there being no fans in the building, I really don't think there's a home.
Yeah, I don't know how that would work.
Going on right now. It's everybody's got to get up at the same time. Everybody's playing in there. Everybody's playing relaxed. I really don't see where the competitive advantage comes in. Right.
It has to get kind of like subtle and kind of like obscure. Like they're used to the local climate or something.
And that would be what it is. Like there's this thing. When you go to Denver and you play in the altitude up there, a lot of Denver athletes, those Denver teams are used to that. So that's considered their advantage because they don't have to adjust to the altitude level when they play out there. So I guess to that degree, just being able to know your surroundings, seeing scenery that you're used to seeing, you're not in a different environment. So that, if anything, it would be that.
But that's not. It's not enough to say, well, that's why they're winning.
Right.
No, that's not why they're winning. It might help a little bit, but the tiniest bit. But no, it's because they're good. And it's because of the preparation and the skill, all that.
And I think this is like when the NBA went to the NBA bubble last year, in Miami or in Orlando. I'm sorry. there were no fans in there, and you got to see the purity of the game. And really, a lot of players who hadn't really showed signs of showing greatness, quote unquote, or just the level of play that they showed in the bubble, they didn't normally show that when games were normal with fans and they had to travel and things like that, because all they had to do was wake up and go to the gym and play basketball. It was the purity of the game, and you got to see who really loves what they do, because that's all they had to worry about. There was no outside distractions. And I think that's the one thing you see now going on in the Olympics. People who really care about their craft, the people who really they don't need all the cameras. They're not there for the recognition and everything. They really just love the sport that they're playing. I think they are the ones who have the advantage in the situation right now where there are no fans.
Yeah, no, I can see that. And it's interesting to hear the purity of the sport or something right now, with nobody, specifically the conversation with Emily, who you booked, who's on the ground, in Tokyo while all this stuff is going on. And we asked her, what's it like? And she said, it's weirdly empty, but that means in some sense it's just the athletes. It's like a game being played by athletes for athletes, and you'll have teams coming out there to watch other teams in unrelated sports, and they're just out there, and it's probably a pretty cool environment,
right?
For that, and in the pure sense for the sport. We're going to go into a break here real quick though, as we wrap up the week, and the Simone Biles saga has calmed down in large part. Any closing thoughts on that? Have you, in other words, hearing her explanation, we've had multiple conversations about it at this point. Any has your view of this changed at all over the last week or two, or are you pretty much in the same place? Because if I remember correctly, well, tell us where were you, and have you changed at all?
The details changed as the week went on, and even after that, even since our last conversation, more details that came out. She said that her aunt had passed while she was out in Tokyo, so that kind of contributed to her mental breakdown, so to speak. And I mean, she ended up coming back, getting bronze. That's cool. My issue isn't necessarily with Simone. It's more so with just the people who like to just make everything such a big deal, if that makes sense. It's like, all right, yeah, she came back, she got the bronze. Cool. I'm happy for her. But, like I said the other week, I would have rathered her more so, instead of trying to pin it on mental health. And maybe to her, it was mental health, and maybe it was. And in every sport, mental is a big part of it. So I understand. But it seemed to me that it was more of the performance that she was upset with. She didn't feel it. She got the twisty, she called it. So, she pulled herself out. And I can understand that. But it just seemed like the mental health thing was something that she hopped on. And now when she came back and she won the bronze, everybody's like, good job for her. She's taking care of her mental health and all that. And I get it. That is big. I'm all for mental health awareness. It's just like, are we going to pin that on everything?
Yeah.
Is everything going to be considered that? Because, I mean, it's days where I don't feel it. We do this show early in the morning. Am I going to call, hey, I need a, I'm not feeling it today. I'm tired, and I think it's messing with my mental health this morning. I don't know.
Where's the line? Where's the line? Yeah.
So that's where it is. It's like we're just making this such a broad situation. It can get a little dangerous sometimes. And not saying that she did, but some people could take advantage and use it as an excuse going forward. And that's what I fear.
Totally.
The people will start to abuse it and use it as an excuse and start to cry wolf to the point to where we may not even believe the people who actually are in jeopardy of, ruining their mental health and want to take a step back. We just turn a blind eye, like, oh, here's another one, another mental health. Like, I don't want it to become part of the norm, if that makes sense.
You just want to find the right way to respond to it, basically. And there are a lot of people who overreact and will kind of over-respond to it. I'm going to take us to a break. But I agree with you. Ultimately, we come down to pretty much, from what you said, coming down basically in the exact same place. There are a lot of people who will spin this. But ultimately, all that you really want to do is like, I've got to take her at her word with this one. I've got to sort of trust her on this one. And people should be able to know themselves and kind of be able to, okay, if you decide to pull up because it's just going to be a mistake, it's going to be really bad for you to do that thing, you should be able to do that. But you don't want to be too lenient, and you don't want to have this culture where people are constantly like just being complacent.
Yeah, and I don't want to get soft, to be honest.
Exactly,
with you.
that's what it is.
It's sports. Like, sports is
you're supposed to push yourself.
And you're supposed to push yourself to the brink, test your limits, and face adversity. That's what makes the greats the greats. They beat adversity and they get the job done by any means. And You know, I just don't want it to become a participation award for all these professional sports where people not saying, I understand she's not necessarily making millions of dollars contractually from the sport, but there are people who do, and I just don't want it to become so soft. Totally. I just don't want sports to become soft.
Totally. Well, we're coming back on a conversation, continuing talking about the Olympics, talking about sports, also talking about the economics of the Olympics. We're going to be getting into this with our next guest, Glenn Austin Anderson. Again, for folks listening, this is a brief pre-record from yesterday, midday yesterday. So pretty up to date. We're talking about who hosts the Olympics, why that's changing. A smaller number of cities are going to be hosting it. Also, we got into race walking for just a minute. If you've been wondering about what race walking is, what it looks like, where it came from, and larger questions about what the Olympics are, what they're going to look like in the years and decades to come. Stay tuned for this interview. Coming right back with Glenn Austin Anderson. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are joined by our guest, Glenn Austin Anderson. He's an award-winning documentary director, producer, and journalist. He's also the professor at the Catholic University of America and Shenandoah University. He helped launch the BBC's YouTube channel and has worked with military.com, CBS College Sports, The Guardian, Fox Sports, Yes Network, Facebook, and many more. He is also the director of the film Coogan's Way, which you should go check out. Just search for that. You'll find that pretty quickly. Again, Glenn Austin Anderson joining us. Thank you for being with us this morning. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Loving watching the Olympics. It's thrown off my sleep schedule, but enjoying it.
No, that's interesting. I'm actually going to get into that real quick. In conversations yesterday, I've heard that Peacock has become a little bit unpopular. The NBC's Peacock streaming service, NBC has the basic sole rights to broadcast this stuff, but basically people who don't use Peacock are pissed because they're having to watch it on a delayed schedule. Does that have anything to do with your sleep schedule?
Well, some of the track and field that I want to watch, I'm a big track and field fan, is only going to be found on Peacock in the mornings. I think it's an interesting product. I had only really downloaded it on the trial version when it first came out. I think they, if you're used to a Netflix, if you're used to, other products, streaming figured out, the Peacock app is not the most user-friendly thing in the world, but NBC's heavily invested in it. In fact, just yesterday they announced that one of the Notre Dame football games that they have the exclusive rights to is going to only be on Peacock in the fall. So NBC's all in on it.
And it's a big deal for them. I mean, obviously, the Olympics are like the premier international sports event, and sports is something that people still do pretty consistently watch. As news media and other forms of media have waned over the years. I want to get into the general conversation briefly. How have the Olympics gone so far? This was a big year, delayed from last year, and some confusion both within the event and leading up to it, with the creative director getting fired, and a state of emergency going on in the city, and everything with Simone Biles and Sha'Carri Richardson on the U.S. side. Anyway, how has it gone so far, Glenn?
I mean, I think the competition on the field, when you get down to the sporting, I think there's been some really, really great moments. There's like small countries winning their first medals. Burkina Faso, San Marino, Bermuda won their first ever gold medals. So I think those things are all like really fun and really like play into like the Olympic spirit. On the other end, one of the big things about hosting an Olympics is that you invite the world to your front door, and the world's supposed to experience your culture in your city. And I just feel like in Tokyo, that's not really happening because there's no crowds, and even the people who are there are kind of under rigid rules about where they can go and what they can do. So it kind of feels like it's just the sporting events. It's just what's going on the field of competition, and that's that. It just feels like a missed opportunity for the people of Japan. It feels like a missed opportunity for the sort of global exposure, which is what the Olympics are all about.
Absolutely. We've heard, speaking with people, including, I believe, you, about the Olympic Village being its own kind of, its own village, its own like city within a city sort of. And usually I would assume there's some degree of like cross-contamination or people moving from the Olympic Village into the city. And it's a tourism draw, and clearly people are coming for the Olympics. That is not happening this year, to be clear, which is what I can, that's part of it, is that the whole ambiance, the environment, the context for it makes it weird. But nevertheless, it seems to be going okay overall.
Overall, it seems to be going fine. But the sporting events are happening, and we're crowning Olympic champions, and that's wonderful. And there's going to be some really great touching moments, and all of that's great. But the Olympics were always kind of more than that. It was, it wasn't sports in a bubble. The Olympics was hosting the world's greatest party, and Japan put up the money and built the infrastructure to do this. And it's almost like if you threw a big party and you got all of the party supplies, you got all of the drinks, all of the food, and then there was no one there to celebrate with.
Absolutely. I can see that. Okay. In an interesting way, you're kind of getting into the changing role of the Olympics. And this might be, we're getting to this conversation, larger conversation about how cities formerly benefited and have in some cases benefited from hosting the Olympics, but how it increasingly has become a very costly endeavor. We were having a conversation about this with our producer, Austin, and your former pupil, I believe. We were having this conversation yesterday, and we got into it on a cursory level. I wanted to go to you on this one because I believe he learned a lot of this from you. How, specifically economically, how have the Olympics changed? And cities and countries hosting it, is it a benefit to them economically to host these things? Who is benefiting from the Olympics? I can imagine media companies and undoubtedly the athletes. Who benefits here? What do cities and countries get, and how has that changed over the years? Glenn?
Well, I say let's hop in our time machines back about 45 years ago. Denver, Colorado, which, if you stop to think about it, probably makes a lot of sense to host a Winter Olympics. They've got all the ski resorts nearby. They've got a lot of infrastructure that they could leverage from nearby colleges and universities. Denver, Colorado was set to host the 1976 Winter Olympics, and they won the bid. They won the rights. They had a logo. The things were happening. And the voters of Denver and the voters of Colorado said no. And the IOC ended up having, the International Olympic Committee ended up having to scramble and find a place to host the Olympics. They ended up doing it in Austria that year at a place that had hosted 12 years earlier, so they had the infrastructure in place. But it was just the first city to have this reckoning moment to go, no, this is ridiculous, all of this infrastructure. And especially like when you look at what the IOC demands of the host cities, the Olympics just become bigger and bigger and bigger, and they end up with these white elephant infrastructure projects that these cities end up not needing. Probably the most stark example of this is Greece has been having lots of economic problems for the better part of 2 decades. They weren't really in the position to host in 2004 economically. And once the world left their great party, they did a great job hosting. They kind of spared no expense. When the world left, they just let the venues go derelict. And the fact of the matter is, not that many people in Greece play softball. So they didn't need a world-class softball facility in Greece.
Well, and that gets onto the part of this that might be counterintuitive, because when I was first getting into this, and even not knowing that much, I sometimes sort of forget what I've learned. You think the Olympics draw people, right? It's good for tourism. It brings a lot of people into the city. And that undoubtedly is good for the local economy. You have dollars and yen and all these currencies, money coming in from countries around the world as people come in to watch the Olympics. And then you can imagine maybe this is an opportunity for the city to invest in their local infrastructure. And I'm specifically talking about roads or public services, those kinds of things to impress the people who are coming in. And then you admittedly also have the stadiums and things like that. But I sort of don't think about that. But that turns out to be one of the most expensive parts of this. Doesn't it, Glenn? What's the cost benefit? Can you like looking at this almost economically? What are the costs? What are the benefits? What might people not know about this, Glenn?
So I think there's going to be a change, and it's an interesting question. I mean, the costs are these building these facilities is enormous, and you look at something like London. They took an entire area of the city that was kind of underdeveloped, and they use this as an opportunity to build around it and create a new sort of residential hub of the city. And that's very admirable. Greece, 2004, they used it as an opportunity to launch a new international airport that was long overdue for the city. And yes, there's those kind of investments that people could get excited about. But do we need 14 arenas? Is the highest priority for the people of Rio de Janeiro to have 4 identical sports arenas lined up right next to each other in the harbor?
And that's another side of this. So we've looked at it sort of more from the economic angle, from the city's angle, from the government's angle. How about from the public? Are these, like you used the phrase white elephant, are these seen effectively as expensive blessings bestowed from above or something like that, where, okay, they get the local population, people living in the city and in the country whose budget this ultimately falls upon, they think, this is good and all, but it's also hellaciously expensive. We're going to have to deal with that. Is that where they're coming from with this? And I don't mean to be overly generalizing or trying to represent people.
There are still places that want it, but the bidding has become less privileged. Historically, the bidding would have these rounds of voting, and it would be highly political and lots of promises made. And in certain cases, it was very corrupt. Now the International Olympic Committee is kind of hoping people bid and kind of hoping people put packages forward. So the next 3 Summer Olympics were just kind of, for lack of a better term, assigned rather than go through a formal voting process. And if you look at the 3 of them, they're first world developed countries first world developed democracies that have a lot of infrastructure already built. And those next 3 cities are going to be Paris, Los Angeles, and Brisbane. And, I think the days of, taking a risk and putting it somewhere economically developing are kind of going to stop for a while.
So that is a change. And this is, we're a political show. We like to talk about geopolitics and diplomacy and these other slightly more highfalutin subjects or whatever. I will turn it to that for just a second here. That sounds like a definite change on the economic side of things and in the structure of, who's hosting the Olympics. It's a pretty simple thing. If it's getting to a smaller number of countries, that's going to impact it. The Olympics historically, can you just lay out, last time we had you on, we were talking about Olympia, this movie directed by Leni Riefenstahl in the 1936 Olympics. And the image that I have, living only, many decades later, is that it was a big geopolitical spectacle. It was of immense political significance. Populations the world around looked to this as a way for countries to prove their merit on the international stage. Has that changed? Because this change seems like that would impact a lot of other things that we might not become aware of until 2020 reveals it. I mean, until hindsight reveals it to us or whatever, until after, in retrospect. Do you see that changing, Glenn?
No, I think it's not changing, but it's become a little more less obvious, I guess. It's become a little more covert. I mean, if you look at the next Winter Olympics, it got down to 2 countries, candidates, and they were the only 2 countries still left bidding when all was said and done, and that was China and Kazakhstan. Both had to build tremendous infrastructure. The Winter Olympics have very bizarre infrastructure when you stop to think about it. You don't need that many luge tracks in the world. So China is doing this the same way they did with Beijing in 2008 to say, look, world, we have the infrastructure, we have the prowess, we have the ability to host this thing. Come check out how great we are. There's been a lot made of the medal count in this Olympics, and I've said in my class, I was talking about sort of contemporary Olympic history that I hate the medal counts because it just seems like this geopolitical relic. But there are articles right now that talking about how the U.S. has the overall most number of medals, but China leads with the most gold medals.
Yes, we were just talking about that this morning.
Yeah, and how China's sort of national pride is very much tethered to their number of gold medals, and they end up doing really well in events that the U.S. probably doesn't even compete in because they're just looking for the opportunities to have those golds. And some of the geopolitics of the gold medal, I think it's still there, and the geopolitics of hosting are still there. I just don't think it's as rah-rah patriotism, rah-rah nationalism as it was during the Cold War era. I don't think we're going to see that for a long time, but I think there's this sort of subversion like, hey, we're pretty good.
Well, and it almost sounds like it still has geopolitical, it still has this significance, like you were just saying. That's the point. But it's gotten more costly, and maybe less countries can afford to do it. And is it just very briefly, because I want to get to one more thing. Is that right, Glenn?
Yeah, that's fine.
That makes sense. Okay, last thing, race walking. So we've only got a couple of seconds left, but you were a race walking athlete. Can you explain this? What is this? What are the rules? What does this look like? Why does it exist, Glenn?
Race walking is a track and field event that sort of has its origins in sort of 19th century long-distance walking contests, and those were a real thing. It was sort of in the evolution of sport. For a while there, long-distance walking was a thing, and it would be like, pub challenges. I'm going to walk to the next town faster than the guy next to me at the pub, and it sort of evolved into this realm of professional walking. So when the Olympic program was made for track and field, or what globally they call athletics, they wanted to include some remnant of these old walking competitions, and they had race walking. And if I sound like a tired dude, it's because I was up at 3:30 this morning watching the men's 20K race walk.
Very interesting. We've got to talk about that sometime. To wrap up, Glenn Austin Anderson, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Absolutely. Great to hear from you guys, and enjoy these final few days of the Olympics.
Thank you. Yeah, it ends just this Sunday. For those listening, Glenn Austin Anderson, award-winning documentary director, producer, and journalist, also a professor at the Catholic University of America and Shenandoah University. He helped launch the BBC's YouTube channel, and he's worked with many organizations, including Military.com, CBS College Sports, The Guardian, Fox Sports, Yes Network, Facebook, and many more. He's also the director of the film Coogan's Way. Give that a search. Go check that out. Great talking with him. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and I am being joined now by Garland Nixon. Jamarl Thomas, normal host, co-host of the show. He is out sick. Hope he's feeling better than he was yesterday when we spoke. But for the time being, and for the next little bit, for the next 20 some odd minutes, I will be joined by Garland Nixon, former host of the show, by the way, Sputnik political analyst, co-host of the Critical Hour and the Critical Hour Extended. This is a show airing Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik. Follow Garland's work, by the way, on that show. Also check him out on Twitter at Garland Nixon, and Garland Nixon on Facebook and on YouTube. Garland, Thank you for joining me this morning. How are you doing?
Wonderful, wonderful. Thanks for inviting me.
Hey, thank you so much for joining again. Always great to talk with you. Always great to have you. And it's also good, I will point out, to be seeing you occasionally now that we're all back in the studio here. It's nice. We never, for the longest time, we never saw each other's faces. You know, I mean, we'd hang out occasionally back in the day. And then we all went into lockdown. And then now occasionally we'll see each other again. I'll come in, you'll be coming in. It's good.
Yes, yes, I do. You know, being a people person, it's funny that, you know, you talk to people during the you know, when people were working from home, et cetera, and there are people like, oh, yes, it was great being home. But being a people person, I like interacting with people. So I like it much better when I'm out and about and talking to people every day.
Absolutely. It's better. It's better that way. It's nicer. And it's also, it makes the shows better. I'll put it like this. Jamarl and I noticed when we came back in, the quality of the show definitely improved, just because, you know, sitting across the table from a person, you can kind of interact with them on a deeper level. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about. We got a couple of things on the menu. I want to get into China based on a conversation you and I were having the other day. But first, I figured it'd be a good idea to come and cover the Ohio loss by Nina Turner to Chantel Brown, who was more the Democratic establishment pick. That was this Tuesday. Now we're a couple of days after. But of course, at the time and to this point, it still leaves many, specifically on the left, wondering, what does this mean? Is this indicative of some larger shift, you know, more pro-establishment shift on the left's base? Is this the more progressive style policies backfiring, where, you know, they've been kind of hard on members of the squad, arguably people online, specifically on Twitter? People have been pushing members of the squad, and then if, you know, there was the force the vote movement a couple of months back. There are a bunch of different ways in which arguably progressives have been demanding. But that's what a constituency is supposed to do, isn't it, Garland? I mean, I'm left, you know, wondering what you're thinking about this. Where do you fall on this one?
A couple of things. Number one, you know, there are a lot of self-serving arguments. If you want the party to go further left, then you argue the party didn't go far enough left. If you wanted to go further right, you say, well, we were too far to the left. So I think the first thing you have to do is dismiss the self-serving arguments that are going to be put forth in the media and look at the numbers yourselves. The Democratic Party, 88% of the Democratic Party are in favor of Medicare for all. If you look at Medicare for all, free college, et cetera, the things that the Bernie Sanders wing of the party is known for supporting, the numbers say that the constituency of the party overwhelmingly support these things. They're not far left. They're not far right. Populism is what? The population, the largest part of the population supports something, right? So these are populist policies, at least within the context of the Democratic Party. The problem that the Democrats have is it's the other 12% that runs the party. So one of the things that let me give you a tweet that I put. Shocker, a corrupt puppet for corporations and the Israel lobby won another congressional seat. Man, who could have possibly saw that coming? That was my tweet. So it was, we've got a person in Chantel Brown who right now, who during this election period, she's being investigated for funneling millions and millions of dollars to her boyfriend's company. So here's the bottom line. She's a perfect Democrat. Based on the leadership of the Democratic Party now, she fits in well. Corrupt, giving money to her friends, you know, owned by AIPAC and the corporations. It makes perfect sense to me if you look at who the leadership of the Democratic Party is and what they're doing. There's nothing weird about this. So the leadership of the Democratic Party did what they do. They stepped in and they ensured that someone who is aligned with their policies and the policies of their corporate and AIPAC backers won. I don't trust. Do I trust it? No. Do I trust the machines? Ohio is known for all kind of election chicanery. I don't trust any of that stuff. But it makes sense that she would win because the people who run the party make sure people like that win. The question that progressives have to ask themselves, you know, it's like the guy keeps asking a girl for a date and she says, you're not my type, or you're too short, or you're too tall, or you don't have hair on your face, or I only date guys with hair on my face. The woman just keeps saying to you, you ain't my type. I don't want to date you. And the guy just keeps coming back and says, how about Saturday? At some point, you got to realize you ain't her type. And progressives just don't seem to get the message.
In other words, it kind of doesn't matter. I mean, because we've been having this conversation. Jamarl's a bit more in this stuff than I am, just because he's, I think, more on the left than I am. And he follows along, and of course he has a channel and a following, and I don't. We've been having this conversation, and basically he's been involved in it, and he sees progressives pretty much like I laid it out very simply. A lot of angry progressives who are asking in some arguably unreasonable ways for things from their Democratic representatives. But from what you're saying, and he's kind of cynical about this, like that's not the right way to go about doing things. From what you're saying, though, it doesn't matter. You can be as nice as you want. You can be as mean as you want. But policy-wise, they're just not going to go along with you. And I'm talking about the DNC here. Is that basically where you're falling, Garland?
Exactly. You've got to understand who their constituency is. If you're a progressive, let's say your whole thing is Medicare for all, you're pushing Medicare for all. Well, 88% of the Democratic Party polls say supports it. Your constituency is the overwhelming membership, the electorate within the context of your party, if you're a progressive. If you are the corporate Democrats, your constituency is the billionaires. Look at what happened. Bill Kristol, this warmongering neocon guy, right? He is on Twitter saying Republicans should cross over because it was open. Republicans could vote. Republicans, you got to go over and you've got to vote for Shontel Brown. The bottom line was the Lincoln Project, et cetera. That's who the leadership of the Democratic Party is. So if you're a progressive, the leader of the Democrat Party hates you. They do not like your policies. They are not in favor of them, even though the constituency is. And a lot of constituency is, I always say this. We don't have two parties anymore. We've got two brainwashed cults. Two groups of people who believe things that are patently absurd. Well, that's who the party is now. And progressives need to, why are you going to keep asking this woman for a date? She's told you, you're not my type. Oh, well, how about Sunday then? That's what the progressives are doing as far as I'm concerned. I don't know. I don't blame the Democratic leadership. They've told you they're not going to let you win. It's like in 2024, when it comes up, are progressives going to run in the primaries? How absurd would it be for some progressive Bernie Sanders type to run in the Democratic primaries when you already know Obama will step in? They will all step in. They will ensure you don't win. It would be preposterous to me for a progressive to run in the presidential primaries in 2024 because this thing's over. It's not democracy there. They've let you know that. Let's not go along with this pretense that the party is a Democratic party and that it's open for whoever the constituents may choose. In fact, Barack Obama said, if it looks like Bernie's going to run away with it, I'll have to step in. What does that mean? If the Democratic process takes place and the people in the party determine that they want Bernie Sanders, the party ain't going to let that happen. This is not a democratic process here. So I don't get mad at the party. They've told you who you are. At what point are you going to say when somebody shows you who they are, believe them?
I hear you. I'm reminded of Albert Otto Hirschman, the great sociologist who had this idea, this model: exit, voice, and loyalty. Those are the responses you have in a political system to things going on that you don't like. You either leave, exit, you speak up, voice, or you just kind of go along and you don't say anything. That's loyalty. And it sounds like you're advocating for exit, just getting out. Or in the words of the great Timothy Leary, drop out, turn in, tune in, turn on, certainly, but also drop out. I'm going into a break real quick here, Garland. I'm going to be bringing us back. We're going to be getting into China. I also want to talk about COVID in light of recent developments in New York City. I want to compare and contrast Italy's Green Pass with the Key to New York City Pass, the Key to NYC Pass that we were talking about on your show just the other day. Because I think if we look at what Italy is doing, and I'll get into it, they're handling it in a way that I think is a bit more amenable to American values and arguably would go along a little bit better with how we do things around here. But hey, we'll have to get back to that on the other side. I am joined by Garland Nixon, Sputnik political analyst and the co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended. That's a show airing here on Radio Sputnik every Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern. And you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Coming back with Garland Nixon on the other side of this short break. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, although today it's just me. I'm Stranahan. Jamarl Thomas, normal co-host of this show, is out sick. For the time being, for this segment specifically, I'm joined on the line by Garland Nixon, Sputnik political analyst and the co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended. That's a show airing here on Radio Sputnik every Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern. And I'm going to take us now to New York City and Italy at the same time. I want to compare their two programs. We have the NYC, the Key to NYC Pass, with New York City Mayor, which New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio announced earlier this week. That will be coming into effect within the next few weeks on a partial basis, and then going into full effect basically over the next month. Now, how this works is for indoor venues, including indoor eating, indoor entertainment, including things like gyms, movie theaters, concerts, all of the above. In order to get inside, you will need to show proof of vaccination. In Italy, they have a similar program. They have their own pass. They're calling it the Italy Green Pass. And it works sort of similarly. In order to get into indoor eating, indoor entertainment, concerts, music venues, etc., basically the same thing. You need to show either proof of vaccination or a negative PCR test, or that you have been you have gotten COVID and then recovered from it within the last 6 months. In other words, that you have natural immunity. Now, in my opinion, that would go along a lot better than what we have right now in New York City, which is in New York City, basically, there are a lot of people who, and I've heard about this, they caught COVID, they're cautious about the vaccines, but because they caught COVID, they have some natural immunity built up. And therefore, they're less likely to spread it, they're not as likely to get as sick from it, et cetera. They have some of the, natural immunity. And right now, they can't go out. They have to get a vaccine. And if they don't want to get a vaccine, and for whatever reason they might not want to, they just are forced to stay inside, no order takeout or eat outside, that kind of thing. They basically don't have the same sort of rights as consumers as other New Yorkers, even though arguably they're just as immune. And one more thing before I pass it to you, Garland, to get your take. In New York City, under this pass program, they don't require that you be fully vaccinated. This is one of the parts that actually kind of shocked me when I learned about it. They only require that you get the first shot, which means they don't need you to be protected, because you're not fully protected until a couple of weeks after you've gotten your second shot. In fact, there are a lot of people dying from COVID with just one shot because they're not fully protected, so you're not going to be nearly as safe as you would. Yet in New York City, they're allowing people to return, eat indoors, et cetera, when they're not fully protected. All they need to have is the first shot, which means this is not a public safety program first and foremost, at least not in a direct sense. It's a vaccination program. And sure, that will make people safer after they get vaccinated, but people can still get sick as they're going out. And I don't know that it kind of doesn't make sense to me. It feels a bit counterintuitive. Anyway, Garland, I kind of laid out my case here. I got out ahead of it. What do you think about all this? I'm laying out an idea. I think it would be better if we handled it the way Italy did. What's your take on it? Does this make sense to you?
A couple of things. And, I have some issues with it from the perspective of a person's, constitutional freedom of movement, et cetera, and some of the things that we're finding out right now. Number one of the things that we're finding out is that people who have been vaccinated can still be infected with COVID, can still spread it, and can have an equal viral load with those who have not been vaccinated. Which means if the plan here is to stop the spread, you could have a restaurant full of people who are all vaccinated, and half of them could have an equal viral load to the unvaccinated and literally spread it to the other half because they can still catch it. So the issue is, if a vaccination lowers the probability of you going to the hospital and dying, they'll spread it to everyone, and those people most likely won't die and more than likely won't go to the hospital, but it will still be spread. So if the intent is to stop the spread, and people who are vaccinated can still catch it and spread it, I don't see, just from a logical perspective of what your goal is, I don't see how that furthers your goal of stopping the spread. And I think what we're looking at is the way it is put forward is, hey, if you get a vaccination, you get open to all the wonderful things in New York City, to which I would argue, well, actually, you already have those. That's not you're not getting open to something. You can do that. You can go to restaurants, you can go to gyms. right? So it's not like I can go to restaurants and I can go to gyms. And now that I have the vaccination, I can still go to restaurants and gyms. So there's not something opening up to you. This New York City pass, this new world is open and you can do wonderful things. You can always do that. But what you really, all you're saying is half the people in New York who aren't vaccinated can no longer do that. I understand it. And just forget how I feel from a logical perspective. If the vaccine was effective in stopping the spread and people who were vaccinated couldn't spread it, couldn't catch it, and couldn't carry an equal viral load with the unvaccinated, well, this would be logical. Whether I agreed with it from a perspective of personal freedoms or not, it would be logical. But since they can still spread it the same, it's not logical. It's not effective in what you're trying to accomplish. That's my only position. You know, I have my issues with it, but just from that perspective, it doesn't seem to me that it will be effective in accomplishing what they're trying to accomplish, which is ostensibly stopping to spread the virus.
Agreed. And then there's also a question, and it's like the messaging is so counterintuitive and confusing, and it's been going back and forth on these different lines on so many grounds. Because in the last month, it has come out, like you said, nothing you've said in terms of the facts here about the vaccines and how effective they are against the Delta variant specifically. None of that's controversial. It's now come out, and it's a matter of basically, authoritative record that people who get vaccinated, you can get as much of the Delta variant as people who are unvaccinated. You're just far safer, from it. You're much less likely to be hospitalized or to fall critically ill, that kind of thing, but you can spread it. That part is not controversial. And yet at the same time, I will hear people talking about, if you get vaccinated, you're reducing the rate of spread. You're making it safer for other people. And there's this, without explaining that, no, that actually is no longer true. We have this new variant that makes it so that the vaccinated are as equally likely to spread. I've heard some people putting that. But my point is, you have to fill in a lot of this information for yourself. You have to make the arguments. Each person reading into the situation actually has to think through it on their own. The government, the medical authorities haven't done any real kind of job of explaining, hey, here's why this changed. On a pretty much day-to-day basis, they're changing what they're recommending, but they're not really laying it out for people. And in the process, people are feeling like they're being misled. They're being lied to, even though they maybe technically aren't. It's never explained to them. You know what I mean? They're kind of left in the dark, and they kind of have to fill it in and connect the dots for themselves. And when people are forced to do that, and you have this higher power that keeps changing its mind, apparently arbitrarily, it's like if you have a boss and they're constantly giving you different sets of orders that contradict each other. And you can sort of, in a good faith interpretation, you can explain to yourself, okay, this is why they're telling me to do all these different things. There's some internal logic that you can kind of figure out. But if it happens for long enough, or if you're just if you're sufficiently annoyed with them, you will stop doing that. You'll just think they make no sense. They're lazy, or they're hypocritical. They don't know what they're doing, that kind of thing. You'll assume the worst about them, basically, because they haven't clearly explained themselves to you. And I think that something very similar is going on with the government. They could have handled this so much better. What's your take on that, Garland?
Yes, and that is because, if you look at the United States, Caitlin Johnstone wrote a great article. And basically what she said is after Russiagate, right after what happened with Russiagate, with some of the preposterous arguments that the United States government has pushed on Russiagate, but we could go on lots of other things. Look, if you go to court and you lie to a judge once, you lose your credibility. And what has happened in the United States is that our government / media / think tank group complex has propagandized people to a point where those who have consistently researched the claims made by the media have come to view the media with a jaundiced eye, who have come to say, man, I don't believe these people. They're constantly, let's see, they lied to me about Iran. They lied to me about weapons of mass destruction. They lied to me about Russiagate. Right now, they're lying to me about China. They're lying to me about Cuba. So what happens is they've lost credibility to a point where even if they have a valid argument about something, people are going to assume, you know what? Within a few months, I'm going to find out if it's all a pack of lies, because that has been consistently so for years now. So Caitlin Johnstone makes it's not relevant to her argument, is not relevant to the the efficacy of the vaccine or the reality of whether or not it's needed or not, or any of the other COVID measures taken. It is, you people have lied so much, you've lost your credibility with a lot of reasonable people in the United States. In fact, most reasonable people do not see the U.S. government and the U.S. media as credible arbiters of reality. So they're like, well, whatever they're telling me, I can't possibly believe it. And that's a problem that's not easily fixed. And it's a valid criticism for people. It's a valid position for people to take since they've lied. I mean, you look at Russiagate, for God's sake, the Steele document, all this stuff. Why would you believe people?
100%.
And that's the problem.
100%. 1,000%. And they can't recover it so easily. It's already burned to ashes. Garland, we're out of time. We got to close it out. Garland Nixon, Sputnik political analyst and the co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended. Check that out, 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern here on Radio Sputnik. Garland, thank you for joining me. We'll be back in a minute with headlines and the last hour of this morning show. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the capital of the divided states of America, it is time now for another hour, our last this morning and this week, of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across the four corners of these divided states we call America, and from across the increasingly divided, embattled, fragmented surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan. And in the left corner, absent from the studio right now, but together here always in spirit, I'm joined by Jamarl Thomas, normal host, co-host of this show. And together, that means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, that intro was confusing enough. Let's be clear. Jamarl Thomas, my normal host, co-host, he is sick with flu, we believe, not COVID, we don't think. He's out, and so for now, it's me, although occasionally our producers, either Austin or Cordell, will be coming in. I believe Austin will be joining me in a few minutes. But before I get into headlines here, and we've got COVID statistics, we've got international news, we've got headlines to get into, we're taking your calls. So if you want to call in about 5 to 10 minutes, 202-521-1320 is the phone number. We're not going to be taking calls at the end of the show today because we have a packed hour this hour, and we'll be going right through to 10 a.m. when we close this out. So again, I repeat myself. 202-521-1320 is the phone number, and your last and best chance to call is in about 5 minutes. Without further ado, though, let's get into COVID news. First up in COVID headlines. There are about 127,000 new COVID cases reported in the United States as of yesterday. There were also about 440 really new deaths over the past week. There have been an average of just over 100,000 cases per day. We've passed that 100,000 case average. That's an increase of 119% from the average 2 weeks earlier. That's more than double where we were 2 weeks before. 50% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated at this point, and 58% of residents have received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected about 35,565,530 people across the United States. It's also killed 615,400 people. In Italy, indoor eating and entertainment venues across the country will from today begin to require a COVID Green Pass. That's a certificate that a person will have to pick up that will show proof of either vaccination or proof of a negative PCR test within 2 days, or proof that they've recovered from COVID-19 within the 6 months prior to trying to enter the venue. This is 2 more options than the one option New York City will be giving people trying to go for indoor eating. There, in the Key to NYC pass that Bill de Blasio, New York City's mayor, laid out earlier this week, basically people have to be vaccinated. And in Italy, in addition to vaccinations, they're also letting people go inside after, having a negative PCR test or after having recovered. I keep beating this horse this morning. I keep making this point. Admittedly, it's getting old, but I think that's a lot better. I think people would get along with that a lot more I think there'd be less complaint and less reason for complaint, and it would be more consistent. But anyway, in Manila, the capital of the Philippines, restrictions are set to be imposed starting today. The 2-week lockdown will affect upwards of 13 million people. It is set to cost the economy of the Philippines upwards of $4 billion in USD. CNN has fired 3 staffers for working at its New York headquarters without a COVID-19 vaccination. An executive there stated that they have a zero-tolerance policy with non-vaccine compliance. I think Austin is right, and this is largely performative. China has pledged to donate 2 billion doses of COVID vaccines around the world this year. They've also said they would donate around $100 million to the U.S. dollars, that is, for the cause of getting vaccines out to developing countries. In national news, President Biden signed a bill into law that awards 4 congressional gold medals to Capitol Police and other law enforcement personnel who protected the Capitol building during the January 6th insurrection. On the matter, Biden stated, quote, "America owes you a debt we can never fully repay," end quote, and, quote, "We can't allow the heroism of these officers to be forgotten," end quote. In international news, China has reacted to President Biden's decision to grant temporary safe haven to any Hong Kong residents currently in the U.S. They're calling the move by Biden gross interference, quote unquote. Biden said this was in response to China's continued assault on Hong Kong's autonomy. The Taliban has shot and killed the director of the Afghan government's Information Media Center. A Taliban spokesman said the man had been shot and killed, quote, "in a special attack of Mujahideen," end quote. Greece is waiting for a return of wildfires, and an extreme fire warning has been issued in Athens. This comes as ongoing historically high temperatures are helping to spread a blaze that has been burning on the outskirts of Athens. In North Korea, state media says that storms and flooding have razed thousands of homes. That set of events will aggravate food shortages that have been ongoing in the country. And in Seoul, South Korea, authorities are investigating whether activists protesting the South Korean government's decision to buy fighter jets from the United States were actually North Korean activists working to create a covert network in the South. In Olympic news, so far the medal leaders from the Olympics in order are the United States out in front, who made a huge leap and are now leading by 19 medals total. Then China is in second place, then Russian athletes are in third, then Great Britain and Japan in fifth. China has the most gold medals, however, with 35. The U.S. currently follows at 31, then Japan is sitting in third with 24 golds. 2 Belarusian Olympic coaches have been stripped of their accreditation after attempting to force the sprinter Kristina Tsimanouskaya to return home. She is a Belarusian sprinter who, again, was trying to seek asylum and successfully got asylum from Poland specifically after not wanting to go back home to Belarus. Then the Belarusian government was reportedly cracking down on and threatening her family, including her husband and her parents. Not a good situation. The U.S. women's basketball team dominated Serbia in a 79-59 victory in the semifinals. That's thanks in large part to Brittany Griner's 15 points and 12 rebounds. They're taking on the winner of the Japan and France semifinal matchup next in the gold medal game. And in earth and science news, the raging fires in California have reached and decimated the historic gold rush town of Greenville. Little of the site remains, as some of the driest conditions in decades were reported in the area. Many of the lost buildings were constructed in the 19th century. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And joining me in the studio now, we have Austin Pelly. I see that he's not able. There we go. Austin,
there you go. Hello,
thanks for joining me. Yeah. How you doing?
Good. Yeah.
Good to hear.
Good to see that U.S. went up about 5 medals since I was last in here.
Really?
Yeah.
I wasn't paying
actually, we went up 6 and then China went up 1. So.
Oh, but that's 5 total. That's pretty good. I was trying to figure out Greenville, the last headline. I was trying to figure out if I had been there recently. I have not. I was up in that area during last year's set of fires. You weren't with the station then, of course, but I was right by this ongoing fire. I saw these massive fires, and no, it's not.
I'm not super educated on national parks. My girlfriend really is, but apparently there's one very close that is pretty much permanently shut down now, or at least for the foreseeable future until it recovers because of the amount of damage that these fires caused.
I believe that. I wonder which one it is, though. I wonder if it's one that I really like, because I'm trying to. Do you think it's like a California park? Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because there's some really good parks in California. Beautiful territory, man. I'm going to tell you that right now. We've got callers, though. I put out the line for calls, and now I'm delaying taking them instead of just talking about national parks. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. We've got 3 people on the line right now. That means we're probably full, but we might have room for one more. Let's go to Tarif, calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
I have 3 comments. First, I'd like to say free Julian Assange, free Danger. Danger is going to be on Democracy Now! Today. I have to just put that out there and hands off of Haiti. I have 3 comments. My first comment dealing with, it seemed like Hezbollah been launching rockets in response of shelling in southern Lebanon. So Hezbollah seemed like they just joined in the fight with the people, the Palestinians that was launching rockets in southern Lebanon. So it's been going on for the past 2 or 3 hours now. So just hope and pray it don't escalate from there, that they come to peace in that region. And my second comment is dealing with, this it seems like we got this feudalism taking place in this country on it. Some people can protest and others can't. You can't protest for whether or not to get the vaccine or not, or Medicaid for all, or anything else. But when it comes down to politicians jumping on the Capitol, which is have security around it, which they somehow miraculously made it through, they can protest on front of the Capitol porch steps, but a person protesting for vaccines or no vaccines, or in all wars, in homelessness, in or a single payer protesting for that, or maybe gun rights or abortion rights or whatever, they can't go in front of the Capitol. It's almost like they're taking what happened for January 6th and they're throwing a casting over everyone and making a 2-class society where you have those that have the privilege to get on television and state their opinion without getting censored, and those that can, and the others that can't do it, you get blackballed or censored, or you can't protest in front of the Capitol because they look at you as a terrorist. I don't want to say terrorist, but as a criminal. That's not right. People should protest in front of the Capitol peacefully without no violence. If they can protest about the eviction moratorium, other people can protest about the eviction moratorium. You know what I'm saying? Which they should have been doing since last month. My last comment, they should have been brought up the eviction moratorium last month, which we didn't have to wait till the last minute. But my last comment is dealing with the Women's Liberation Front in the West Coast, I think it's California. You have transsexuals that's being put taken from out the California prisons, men prisons, and put in the women prisons. I'm not saying all the transsexuals, but they had some cases where a woman got pregnant. Now the Women's Liberation Front is saying that they expect a whole bunch of women that's going to be impregnated because of this, and also domestic violence inside the prisons. And some of these men that's being transferred to these, transsexuals was being transferred to these women's prisons, had rapes on their records. They committed rapes against children and women, And some of them
that sounds really bad. But on the other hand, I look up Women's Liberation Front, and they're like Wikipedia specifically, which, Wikipedia is not the word of God. Wikipedia is going to be biased in various ways. Wikipedia is describing them as one of these TERF groups, a trans exclusionary radical feminist group, which if you follow the stuff, TERFs are basically the variant of feminists who don't like trans people, and an extremely simplified, and that explanation is going to be wrong, and it would piss people off. But broadly, that's the idea. TERFs are the ones who don't like trans people, and they're pretty much universally derided by modern feminism as far as I can tell. Anyway, Women's Liberation Front, which is the group that sounds like you're getting this from, they're described as a TERF group. And they probably have some valid points, but I also just feel the need to put that in as an addendum. In other words, it's said about them that they would have a bias on this thing, if that makes sense. And Tarif, we've got other callers. I'm sorry, I want to move on. Agreed 100% on the first one. There's some, with the exception that last year, the BLM protests were ongoing, admittedly not in front of the Capitol, but in front of the White House. They pushed them out of the White House, but we were allowed to do those protests. I on the other hand, I hear what you're there is the worry that following January 6th, all forms of civic dissent, peaceful or not, will be criticized increasingly as, evidence of terrorism or evidence of extremism, or that you're infiltrating these groups because you're trying to, drag any opposition to your power down. And it is ironic and sad. Cori Bush and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, very publicly protesting at the foot of the Capitol building. And there's this great clip with Cori Bush the other day, one of the members in the squad. In this 1-minute segment, she goes from describing how she wants security forces to protect her because she's so under threat. She goes from saying that to describing how we need to defund the police. Well, she can afford to hire private security. The public can't. And if she's getting threats, I believe that she's getting threats, but like a lot of people get threats too. I guess my point is she's wanting to deny the public something that she herself can afford in this sort of weirdly, anarcho-capitalist society that she envisions. Anyway, I'm spinning off into nowhere. We've got more callers. I want to go to Malik calling in from D.C. You're on the line. What's on your mind?
Hey, guys. Thanks for taking my call. Great show. I love the segment with you and Garland there. And Tarif made some great points. I wanted to largely discuss the new New York pass. I'm originally from New York. I was just there the other day. There pretty often visiting friends and family. Haven't been organizing there much, but I do plan on going back to do more organizing, largely around this issue. And I wanted to make the point that largely I think is being lost. I don't know if you guys have noticed that some of the governors and the mayors, the Democratic Party mayors, that are largely pushing these draconian vaccine mandates have been caught at private gatherings. I think recently Muriel Bowser was caught at, some private wedding with celebrities and Dave Chappelle among them, and wasn't wearing a mask. And obviously you had that incident, I guess months ago, or maybe even last year with Gavin Newsom.
Gavin Newsom, yep, that was happening. I mean, more recently you had Lori Lightfoot in Chicago attending Lollapalooza, which she allowed to happen. Lollapalooza is a big old open-air music festival thing that goes on. Anyway, she was on stage not wearing a mask, and, what would promote tourism in the city, certainly, but that's kind of hypocritical. And then there's even Barack Obama, who, although he's downscaled it, was trying to have a big old birthday party bash with over, I think it was 700, 800 attendees in Martha's Vineyard. That's in the northeast part of the U.S. Anyway, it would have been a lot of people. Now, he got some flack for that, so he decided to
it was just his friends and family now.
He downscaled it to just close friends and family now.
Which is what, like 400 friends and family?
Well, yeah, you'd hope that he has a lot of friends. He was
2-3 times normal wedding size of friends and family.
Yeah, that's a lot of people. But he said he's downscaled it. Anyway, I hear your point on that, Malik.
Well, my largest point, and I'll get off because I know you guys got to go. You got short time. Is basically what we're dealing with here is we're dealing with an elite class of corporate status. And obviously, with cases like New York and other cities, we're moving into there's not much further between corporate statism and fascism, I grew up in New York, and it's traditionally, even though obviously the capitalist class own the city, but it's traditionally a working class city. It is the poor and working class that produce the culture that people look to New York City for. That's the poor and working class that did that. And so the ruling class have been trying to destroy cities like New York forever. And it seems that these Democratic Party mayors, same as with San Francisco, it seems as if their job is now to destroy those cities.
Well, here's the thing. Malik, thank you for the call. We're going to be bringing Margaret Kimberly in just in a couple of seconds here. I'll get into that with her, but thank you for the call. Brave, you're on. You get a couple seconds. I'm pushing us over just because you're on the line, and this is the last shot for you to call in. What's going on? What's on your mind, Brave?
So I'm basically tapping on what Malik was saying and calls earlier. The problem with these just straight to the point. I take issue with the idea of now separating the populace and saying that you have one group that's vaccinated, that's not the problem, one group that's unvaccinated, that is the problem. When it's now accepted even in the mainstream that the vaccinations and let's call it what it is. The vaccinations largely have been shown to not work, because if the vaccine only provides that you don't get sick as bad and you don't die as much, whereas with the already spreading disease, you are already most likely not going to die unless you had comorbidities, right? Prior comorbidities. What is the vaccine actually doing? And the science is not actually changing. If there have been people like Dr. Robert Malone, who is a part creator of the mRNA vaccine technology, had been saying for over a year now that where we are now is where we're going to be, and that part of the conversation has been shut out.
It has been shut out, but two ways to push back, and we got to go. Right, but thank you for the call. For one thing, Dr. Robert Malone, he's been talking about this ADE thing, and even he's saying this antibody-dependent enhancement thing. I've looked into that. Fans of the show have asked me to look into that. The thing with that is, even he's saying it's still wait and see. And so, I won't get too deep into the claim, but he, as far as I can tell, he's not saying that the case has been made. He's just saying this stuff needs to be looked into more, which I guess I agree with. But coming back to the main thing, the vaccines do kind of work. It's just they keep people from dying. Keep giving. So if you're elderly, if you're over the age of, say, 80, you have a decent chance of dying from COVID-19 if you catch it. If you can reduce that chance by like 99%, I would say that medication works. Going into it, that's a pretty darn good bet for you to get the vaccine. Now, the messaging on literally every other count is a lot more complicated, with young people getting it, whether you're going to spread COVID-19 once you're vaccinated with a Delta variant, that gets more complicated. But just on those grounds, yes, the vaccine does work for that. With that, we need to go into a break. Brave, thank you for the call. Thank you to all of our callers. We're going to be coming back with Margaret Kimberly, senior editor at Black Agenda Report and a resident of New York City. We're going to be talking about Cuomo and these vaccine mandates, this key to NYC pass, with Margaret Kimberly when she comes back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
When the going gets tough, the powerful want propaganda. But we won't let them cancel the facts. Whether you're woke or drowsy, we know that you can handle the truth, and we're giving it to you every morning. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan every Monday through Friday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Your first stop for sanity in a world gone mad.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Although, quick heads up, both for our audience and for Margaret, our guest who's on the line. Jamarl Thomas is out of the studio today. He's sick with, we believe, the flu, and he was not feeling well. I hope he's feeling a lot better this morning. Wherever you are, Jamarl, hope you're slumbering peacefully. Without further ado, though, I'm joined on the line by Margaret Kimberly. She's a senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report and the author of Presidential Black America and the Presidents. Follow her on Twitter at Freedom Ride Blog and find her work at blackagendareport.com. Margaret, we've been having a lot of conversations on this show over the past week about what it's like to live in New York City right now. Just before, I think it was literally the same day that de Blasio announced the key to NYC pass. We had Ted Rall on. We were talking about that with him. He is a resident of the city there. We're also talking with Caleb Maupin. We were having conversations with Professor Richard Wolff. We've been getting different sides of this, basically. And I will admit, abashedly or bashfully or something, it's partly in that same light, as simple as it is, that I'm talking with you. I want to hear from you. You live in the area and you know people, specifically on this key to NYC pass thing. How are people responding to it? What do you personally think of it? What do you think of the program? And how friends of yours, people you know, how do you think the city is going to respond to it? Margaret?
Well, I'm first, good morning. Good to be back. I think New Yorkers are mostly responding positively with a range of opinions. New Yorkers are mostly vaccinated. It varies from neighborhood to neighborhood. But I believe full vaccination, we have like 55 or 56% fully vaccinated, and more than that having gotten at least one shot. So there's buy-in for getting this protection. People are confused, I think rightly so, because we've gotten mixed messages. I blame the CDC, quite frankly, first telling us about a month ago everybody was happy, no masks, everything's good, because the CDC said if you're vaccinated, you don't have to wear a mask anymore, which they should not have said. So there is some feeling of kind of a whiplash. Things are okay. Nope, things are getting worse. But in general, culturally, there's buy-in for protecting ourselves with vaccines. But I think there's a sense of frustration, too, with the mixed messages. Now, I had, for example, they said you didn't have to wear a mask in gyms anymore, but when I went to the gym, I kept mine on. I didn't care I didn't trust what I was being told. So that's going to be a big factor. This app, I frankly am not going to use an app. They've said having a picture of your card on your phone is good enough, and I'm going to leave it at that. I always have concerns about privacy. That makes me somewhat uneasy. But I think in general, people are on board. I would sum it up that way.
That, in its own way, that's good to hear. That's good because I don't like the force, the way that it's being forced, but I get that there's the sense that you have to force it. And of course, the utopian scenario is, hey, everybody decides to get vaccinated and the vaccines are perfectly safe and there are no reason for concern, et cetera. And it works. We all get vaccinated and COVID is knocked out, forever. And it doesn't become this sort of lingering, semi-severe, more severe than the flu-like thing that will just persist for years, which seems to be where we're heading, frankly. But it's interesting. In New York City, it's like the most populated metropolitan area in the United States as far as cities go. And therefore, it leads the way, in both the potential risk of an outbreak catching on. And of course, this is after last year. It was the hub for this stuff the world around. Now, the news of this came out on the exact same day, almost like it was intentional. Bill de Blasio's announcement of the Key to NYC pass came out on the same day that the results of this investigation into Cuomo came out. I'm going to turn to that other take. Similarly, Cuomo earlier this week, we had a conversation with Ted Rall, another guest on the show. Cuomo seemed to be doing okay. He seemed to be doing swimmingly. Then the details of this interview, this interrogation by the two chief investigators looking into his sexual harassment and even sexual assault, it came out. That didn't go so well. Then the next day it comes out. They find him guilty, basically. They're saying he's guilty of breaking federal and state law. And this is all forgetting the fact almost that Cuomo killed thousands, you can argue, by moving people, in nursing homes, into hospitals, and then straight back into the nursing homes without proving that they'd recovered from COVID. That's the real story here, but this is all hitting at once. I want to come back to the second nursing home story, but just on this one, does Cuomo have any chance, or is he a snowball melting in hell at this point? Margaret.
I think he's melting. He still has a reservoir of support. But I think this is just so damning. There were people who tried to argue that this was a setup. People are just trying to get him. It's Rudy Giuliani is after him, all kinds of stories. But he was never popular personally. He had this he always raised a lot of money. I think he had the name recognition of being Mario Cuomo's son, and he was able to raise the $30 million that you need to raise to run a credible race for governor of New York State. So he had that ability, and basically the money just drove other people out. And he always beat up progressives. So, even the Working Families Party, which is in fact just a Democratic Party, would end up endorsing him and frustrate a lot of progressives. But so he was never well liked. But I think this is it. This is enough for anybody sitting on the fence to have to move to one side or the other. I also I've always found it interesting that the sexual harassment story was bigger than the nursing home death story.
Yes.
That seemed to me to be the bigger reason well, there's so many reasons to want him out, but that to me was a lot more damning. The fact that his administration went to great lengths to try to hide this information, That is something, it seems to me, it's impeachable. Now, elected officials, of course, being who they are, they didn't want to touch him until it was clear they could get rid of him, because he was still talking about raising money and running again, and they know the system better than we do. They knew there was still a possibility of him winning again. So people would say, well, he should step down, but, they wouldn't actually talk about removing him from office. So that's where we are now. But the other thing here is the lengths he went to discredit his accusers and using other powerful people to intimidate them. So all of this is very damning, and it's damning to the media, too. The fact they gave him an Emmy Award for his conferences, the fact that CNN, his brother should have recused himself from doing any reporting. Instead, it was the opposite. He was interviewing him and talking about, oh, you've done such a great job. And I'm like, hold up a minute. Are there no conflict of interest standards at CNN? I mean, somebody else should have been doing that. He got his family members tested when nobody could get tested in New York State in those early days because the CDC messed up the testing. And it was hard to get a test. His relatives all got them. So I think taking all of this into account, I think his political career is over. It's hard to win a fourth term anyway, as his father found out.
Yes. Well, and he was, of course, that's what he was running for. He's on 3 terms right now, and that's something that I keep coming back to. Is just imagining, okay, he's trying to best his father, which is a classic driver for people often. But with Cuomo on this one. One more thought that comes to mind before we have to go on our break. And Margaret, thank you again for joining me this morning. Good to talk to you, especially because I'll just bring this up. You are a fairly scarce person. Sometimes we've had this is 100%. You are valued, but it's my point is we haven't had you on as frequently, so it's especially good to talk to you when we do. One big thing before we close on Cuomo, I think how he screwed himself really is by bringing Biden and other Democratic Party people into his defense. When he brings up Biden and says, okay, well, look at how Biden's holding me. Look at his hands on my shoulder. And when he brings them into this, which is, of course, itself in a weird way an extension of the Me Too scandal. Biden has Tara Reade problems. Biden has his own problems. When he brings Biden and other DNC fixtures into his defense, he is immediately putting himself into a position of weakness, because why would they defend him after he does that, right? I mean, in my opinion, that's where he completely screwed himself. Now they have no reason not to completely turn their backs on him. What do you think about that, Margaret, before we close?
Yeah, I think that's true. He's radioactive now. So even Biden said, I think he should step down or something like that. So nobody's defending him anymore. The people who, as I was just saying, are afraid to actually come out and say that he shouldn't be in office any longer, now they no longer have any reason to be afraid. So he just needs to go. He cannot defend himself. He has, always intimidated the press. He's always gone after other people. So I think he's managed to elude the negative press he should have gotten over the years. But now it's over now.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And you know it better than I do. We've got to close it. Margaret, great talking with you, as always. Thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you.
Margaret Kimberly, the voice you just heard is hers. She's a senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report, and she is also the author of Presidential Black America and the Presidents. Go check that out. You can follow Margaret on Twitter at Freedom Ride Blog. That's her handle. Also find her work at blackagendareport.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, coming back on the other side of this short break. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Although, quick heads up for both our guest and the audience, Jamarl Thomas, normal host, co-host of this show along with me, he is not feeling well this morning, so he's out of the studio. He came down with a flu, we believe. Don't think it's COVID. While he's recovering, it's just me in the studio. Although for now, for the next half hour, I'm joined by Michael Goodwin. He's journalist and columnist at the New York Post. Follow him on Twitter at mgoodwin_NYPost. And read his articles at nypost.com. Michael, Mr. Goodwin, thank you for joining me this morning. How are you doing?
So far, so good. Thank you.
Good to hear. Great to have you on. Let's get right into it. A big week in news from New York State and New York City this week. You have Bill de Blasio coming out midweek with the key to NYC pass. Then beginning of the week, you have this news, the interrogation/interview that the two investigators put in charge of the investigation into claims that Cuomo sexually harassed, maybe even sexually assaulted women. Letitia James put these two in charge. They interviewed Cuomo, and what we heard earlier this week is that interview did not particularly go well. It was about 11 hours long, and Cuomo during it said that one of the interviewers, June H. Kim, had it out for him, basically, bringing up a 2014 incident where there was basically an anti-corruption report that Cuomo shut down, and Kim had been one of the ones to interview him. Anyway, that was earlier this week. Then it comes out about a day later that the two who'd been investigating this, including Kim, believe that Cuomo is guilty of crimes, federal and state crimes specifically. Now, these are the Attorney General of New York's people. This is a high-level claim being made about Cuomo. And following the release of that information, the tide turned massively. At the beginning of this week, Cuomo seemed to be mostly healthy. He seemed to have weathered this storm. Now he seems to be on his last legs effectively. At least that's how I see it. That's how we see it from this show's perspective. Michael Goodwin, how do you see it? How's Cuomo doing at this point?
Not so well. If you'll recall, we discussed this before, and just to set the scene, back in March when the bulk of these allegations about sexual harassment were made known. Some went to the press, and then that's when the Attorney General launched this investigation. And there was a great frenzy in March and April, in particular, even into May. But it died down as the investigation proceeded ahead quietly. There were almost no leaks about what was going on with the investigators as they investigated the women, subpoenaed documents, staff members around Governor Cuomo, lots and lots of people. I think in the end, 175 or something like that. People were interviewed, thousands of documents, emails, texts, everything. And so there was this lull, and Cuomo began to sort of gather his footing. He tried to proceed like everything was normal. And I said at the time that I thought this was the lull between two storms. The first storm being the acknowledgement of the investigation and all the allegations, and the second storm would be when the report came out, because the Attorney General said the report would be made public. So I thought we were in this kind of gulch in the interim, and that we had not heard the last of this yet. This subject was coming back with full force, I believed. And so this week we got the second storm, and it was a doozy. The findings are devastating to the governor. He has, as you noted, in recent weeks, he's begun to ramp up his criticism of the investigators. It's not fair, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I think that happened when he realized what he was up against. When he was interviewed for 11 hours under oath by the investigators, he was confronted with the evidence. And you can, like a Venn diagram, you can show when his hostility toward the investigators ramps up. It's when he knows what he's up against. He now knows at that point that 11 women have come forward with very specific allegations, and that the investigators had considered them all credible. And so let me just say one quick thing more. what happened this week with the release of this report by the Attorney General and the acceptance of it by 5 different district attorneys, different counties, looking at anything that might have happened in their county. So you've got 5 criminal investigations now going. Doesn't mean there can be 5 different charges or anything like that, but it's it's a measure of how serious this is being taken. I think you can see that what happened was that the allegations, some of them just in the media, some of them rumored, some of them, out there very publicly, the allegations are now being treated as facts by the criminal justice system and by the political system. And that's what has changed everything. The governor is no longer just sort of able to fight back by saying it didn't happen. The documents, the evidence, the testimony says it did happen. The Attorney General accepts that, says he violated state and federal laws, and that these allegations are credible, and finally, that his testimony before the investigators was not credible. That's a very big event.
That's the huge turn right there. And like you said, you know this, and this makes perfect sense. When he sees that they believe that the claims are credible, that they've got, almost a dozen different women who are making specific claims that they now believe are true, in their interactions with him, he comes to understand they're not buying what he's been saying, basically. If I suspend any, specific belief about whether he's guilty or not guilty, I do believe he's guilty of this stuff. But if I suspend that for a second, wherever he's coming from, that's the moment where he should start to freak out. In other words, if he's innocent and he's like, wait, they actually believe this? That's when he's freaking out. And of course, if he's guilty, which I believe he is, that's also when he starts to freak out. In other words, that's what happened. It makes perfect sense. For his supporters, for the people, and to my shame, I actually don't know any, but to the people who are defending him, I'd love to speak with them. On what grounds do you think at this point they would be defending him? In other words, if he's trying to, support himself, he's trying to get reelected, if he's going for a 4th term, doing what his father couldn't do, on what grounds would he be running for that? How would his supporters defend him going into another election here? How do you see that happening if it's going to happen, Michael?
Well, if you find one of his supporters, let me know, because I don't know of any. I think what has happened is that the polling is collapsing, and so the public support is evaporating before our eyes. There's only been one poll, to my knowledge, since this report came out. Big increase, of course, in the Democrats wanting him to resign. Now 59% of Democrats want him to resign, nearly 6 in 10. It's the significance, of course, this is such a blue state. New York has never been this blue. Even when FDR was governor and then president, there was still always a split in the state legislature among other elected officials. No more. New York is solid blue. And so for Democrats to be turning against him, his own choice of to head the Democratic Party, a man named Jay Jacobs, who has been loyal to Cuomo through thick and thin for many years, came out this week, said he had spoken to the governor, urged the governor to resign, and when the governor wouldn't, he said, I'm done with him, and I can't hold out any longer. He came out publicly and urged the governor to resign. So you have that kind of break. You have the Democrats who would control both houses of the legislature by veto-proof majorities. They are solidly against him. The leaders of both houses have called on him to resign. So the impeachment process is a little behind. It's gathering steam. I mean, this just happened this week. So the impeachment process, which was kind of lagging behind, moving slowly as though it was reluctant, and it was reluctant. But now I think that you're seeing a real increase in the speed and commitment of the impeachment process. And I predict that what will happen is that Cuomo will fight and fight and fight. But much like Richard Nixon, he will throw in the towel when somebody from the inside reliably informs him that he is going to be impeached, that the votes are there, and there's nothing he can do about it except resign.
Yeah.
That's what led Richard Nixon to resignation. It wasn't any kind of admission or any sign of repentance. It was simply that the votes aren't there. And I think that's what is going to come to Andrew Cuomo sooner rather than later.
And real quick, factually on this, isn't the impeachment vote next Friday, this coming Friday, not today, but a week from now?
Well, that's tentatively scheduled, but I don't believe they've actually drawn up any articles yet. They said they're going to give Cuomo's lawyer a chance, Cuomo to make a case for himself. So all of this is in flux when it's actually going to happen. But there is a push for speed, and I think that's again significant, because until the report came out, the impeachment process, which was ongoing, was very much a reluctant, well, if we have to, we'll pretend we're really investigating. But the Attorney General's report was so solid and compelling in that it was a slam dunk. There was no wiggle room. Now, admittedly, these are not rape charges. There's only one, perhaps two women who alleged actual groping,
yes,
overt sexual groping, but there was a lot of touching, a lot of unwanted touching, some allegations of unwanted kisses, flirtatious comments, behaviors, really stuff that's inappropriate in the workplace. And under a law signed by Andrew Cuomo himself, these things are illegal. So, and federal law too. So this is not, it's not rape, but it's not nothing. And I think it's going to push him out.
At the very least, sexual harassment, and in some cases, questionably sexual assault, right? That's just, that is where the uncertainty lies, whether or not some of the groping specifically amounts to sexual assault.
Right. And the Attorney General said that she was not prosecuting these, she was not even referring these, because she thought they were civil in nature. But that final determination will be left up to the county district attorneys where these incidents happened. And so there may be, I mean, particularly on the issue of retaliation, with at least one of the women who have alleged this behavior, there was a clear effort to retaliate. The New York Times writes today that there was, the whole retaliation machinery was in full force. Cuomo is a bully. I mean, everyone knows that. No one disputes that Andrew Cuomo is a bully.
Yeah.
But to use that kind of machinery of government to crush people making allegations against you is not about winning votes. It's about crushing complaints. And I think he crossed the line there. But we will see. There's going to be lots of civil lawsuits, I predict. And whether there will be criminal charges, I don't know.
Absolutely. Okay, so I want to follow up. I want to come back and talk about the key to NYC Pass, how that's being received. But one more thing on Cuomo, just one more point before we go to our break. I'm going to hand this back to you before we take it out here. There's also in my opinion, much more important. It's like an order of magnitude, several orders of magnitude more important. The far more important other crime that I would argue Cuomo committed here, which has to do with nursing homes and old people dying from the coronavirus, after Cuomo ordered people who were in nursing homes who'd been moved to a hospital to be sent back to nursing homes without showing proof of recovery from COVID-19, potentially spreading it to the people who are most susceptible to its worst effects, killing people in large numbers. Not only that, but also covering this process up and basically downplaying the number of people who showed up statistically as having died in nursing homes by listing them as having died in the hospital, even though you would think of them as, okay, these are nursing home residents. That's the category. And then hid this. And it's come out that he hid this. This is the huge scandal. Objectively, in my opinion, more important, although, of course, the sexual harassment allegations are also quite important. In other words, this is the real story here, and yet it seems to have been largely forgotten at this point. There's an FBI investigation that's ongoing, and we'll see if they follow up on that and if the Department of Justice decides to come down on him over this. And based on how Biden's turned in the last couple of days and is now calling for a resignation, if not impeachment, he may actually see something from the Department of Justice. But nevertheless, that has been pushed to the margins on the table here. It's been pushed outside the Overton window. Any signs of movement on this, Michael? And do you agree with me that this is an objectively more important story that has sadly been forgotten while all this other stuff plays out? Michael Goodwin.
I'm glad you brought it up because you are right that life and death is more important than anything else. And I was one of the first to blow the whistle on the nursing home. I mean, I take no credit for coming up with it. A woman who lost her mother in a nursing home knew, she's a retired educator, she did her research. She knew about this order from the Department of Health in March of 2020 that required nursing homes to accept any COVID-positive patient being discharged from a hospital. And they wouldn't even let the nursing homes test them before they accepted them to see if they were still infected enough to spread. Many of these nursing homes simply didn't have the capacity physically, the staff, the equipment. I mean, it was like a fire going through dry grass. There have been studies that showed as many as 1,000 patients in the nursing homes were infected and died specifically because of this order. Now, altogether, New York State lost some more than 15,000 people in nursing homes. Cuomo tried to hide that number from the public. Part of the reason everyone believes was so he'd get that fat book contract for over $5 million about his leadership during COVID.
It's horrifying.
Which looks a lot better when you're hiding the bodies, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And so, yes, those investigations continue. And again, the Attorney General is looking at questions of how he used his staff to help write the book, and the issue of withholding the death totals from the Justice Department and the other federal agencies is also being probed by the U.S. Attorney in Brooklyn. So he's still got a number of investigations going onto his conduct on that issue.
Well, you know what? I'm going to take us into a break right here. But he received an Emmy for these fireside chats that he was giving. Well, like you said, $1 million, more than that. Very profitable book contract, released bestseller, glowing reviews, all while he had killed, like you said, hundreds, possibly thousands of people, and then hit it up very intentionally. It's villainous. I don't know how else to say it. We've got to go into a break, though. We'll be coming back, continuing our conversation about New York-related things. We're going to be talking about the Key to NYC Pass. I'm joined by Michael Goodwin. He is a writer, journalist, and columnist over at the New York Post. Follow him on Twitter at mgoodwin_NYPost. Read his articles at nypost.com. I'll be back with him to close our show out in our last 8 minutes when we come back from this short break. Be right back.
Fault lines.
You check top.
We couldn't put it better ourselves. Tune in to Political Misfits on Mondays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Miss the Press, our weekly takedown of Sunday's toothless news talk shows.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com. Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Quick heads up, Jamarl Thomas is out of the studio today. He is at home sick. I hope he starts to feel better, but I'm sure you'll hear from him again soon as we restart the week this coming week. And with that, I'm joined on the line now by Michael Goodwin. He's a journalist and columnist at the New York Post. We were just talking about Andrew Cuomo, who seems to be on much thinner ice this week after the results of this investigation came out, and he appears to have committed multiple crimes, specifically sexual harassment, maybe even sexual assault. Anyway, we just had that conversation. Let's move briefly to New York City. Bill de Blasio earlier this week came out with the Key to NYC Pass. Now, I will recall, this reminds me, it's kind of an extension of the Excelsior Pass, which New York City specifically was testing out. Madison Square Garden, I remember they had some trial games, large, mid-lockdown, large venues hosting these experimental games where basically they were prototyping the software, the service they were going to be using called the Excelsior Pass, which would basically do what they're doing now. Basically a vetting system that keeps track of, medical records, recent PCR tests, who's vaccinated. It puts that information together, and they would have used this to give people entry to all these different services. It was a state-run program that they were experimenting with. This is the natural follow-up to that program. However, unlike that previous program, this one, you have to be vaccinated. The negative PCR test doesn't apply. And unlike the Italian Green Pass that I was talking about this morning, you also can't get in if you've previously contracted COVID and then recovered from it, giving you some natural immunity. They'll take that in Italy, not so much in New York City. You have to be vaccinated to go out indoor eating, indoor entertainment, gyms, things like that. My point simply is this is a new program that they're testing out, and it's kind of a big deal. Michael Goodwin, speaking as somebody who lives in New York and knows people undoubtedly who live in the area, how is this being received so far?
Well, I think there's a lot of head scratching going on. On one hand, I think de Blasio, who's been a terrible mayor and thankfully is term limited, and so he's coming down to the close, is doing, I think, on one level, the right thing, because what he has talked about, there is, of course, in the Democratic circles, this new mania for masks again. And why don't you wear a mask, wear a mask, wear a mask? De Blasio has taken a really clear stance, and I think it's the right one, that the masks do not help you, really. It's the vaccination that helps you and protects you. And so he said, I don't want to confuse people by telling them that wearing a mask is going to keep you safe. It's not, only in limited situations. And he's right about that. Now, the limited situations, it needs to be defined, but he has pushed aside this idea that you have to wear a mask all the time, wear it inside. I mean, the nonsense coming out of the Centers for Disease Control in the White House is just spectacular. And so I think de Blasio is fundamentally right. Get vaccinated. I'm vaccinated. My family is vaccinated. I encourage everyone to get vaccinated. So I don't have a problem with the idea of stressing vaccination over masks. When it gets into requirements for private businesses, I don't know that he's on solid ground there legally. And a lot of the businesses are very upset about this because he's effectively telling them how to run their business. And some people don't want to get vaccinated. As you say, some people have natural antibodies because they had COVID. And some studies show that's even better than vaccination. Others not so good. But so there's a lot of complexity here that de Blasio has sort of just dropped a hammer on. And I don't think it's going to last. I think there are going to be a lot of objections. I think it's not going to prove practical for a lot of businesses. I mean, you go into a small bodega. Do you have to show your vaccine paper to go into a small bodega and get a bag of potato chips? I mean, it's too much. And so I think that there's going to have to be some kind of a pullback. And I would just say quickly, the reason he is going in this way largely, even among city employees, is that he cannot force the unions to accept vaccination. And they don't. The police unions, even the nurses didn't until he required it in hospitals. Among new employees, he said, you will not get the job if you're not vaccinated. But he cannot make that same requirement of existing employees. And so all these things are workarounds because of the unions. But notice that nobody is demonizing the unions the way they demonize, white Republicans in other areas. So there are a lot of people who are concerned about the vaccine. And part of the reason is that it is still considered an emergency authorization by the CDC. I think when that emergency authorization is lifted, which would follow more long-range testing, then I think you'll have wider acceptance and more confidence in general about the vaccine. But right now, you've got about, 30%, I think, of the adult population in New York City, maybe 35%, that is not vaccinated.
And we're right now just under 30%. I mean, I believe it was earlier this week that we passed the 70% vaccination threshold for adults that he'd been aiming for, Biden had been aiming for from July 4th of this year. I agree with you. The messaging on this stuff has been pretty counterintuitive, and it's no surprise to me that people are left scratching their heads. It's not, from other guests that we've spoken to, most people are simply going to go along with it and comply. But that doesn't, I get why a lot of the people who aren't aren't going to just go along with it and comply. One last thing here. You said that unions aren't accepting this. I hadn't heard about that. You're right. We're hearing mostly about, white male Republicans who are the demographic disproportionately least likely to get vaccinated, or at least that's the narrative here. Why are unions opposed to it?
Well, I mean, I think in the urban areas in particular, it is non-whites who are the largest group of holdouts. And the unions have not said they're opposed to vaccination. What they've said is this is a collective bargaining issue. You have to bargain with us over it, meaning they're going to want something in exchange for it. And to my knowledge, that the bargaining has not really begun, that there is no real bargaining that I'm aware of. But again, you've got say, police officers coming into contact with people in all kinds of ways, naturally. You've got the sanitation department. You've got clerks in office buildings. You have firefighters, et cetera, et cetera. And, a lot of the people, particularly in these first responder emergency situations, are younger. And that is also a cohort that is not as thoroughly vaccinated as are the older generations for whom the virus was more lethal.
Michael, we've got to close here, but good to hear from you on this one, and something we're talking about more some other time, definitely. Michael Goodwin, journalist and columnist at the New York Post. Great conversation with him. We've got to close this show out. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Have a great weekend, folks. See you again Monday, 7 a.m. Eastern. See you on the other side.